Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the illustrious The Big Boys Table. I'm here with IskatuMesk, who is definitely recording his audio because I forgot to ask that before starting my recording. And what's
I am
going
recording.
on? Check it out.
Chaos.
Absolute chaos.
Absolute chaos.
It's been
Chaos
absolutely
control is what we're hoping to try to do here.
For some reason, even though I know that's a Sonic reference, I immediately thought of Warcraft 3, so... it's probably because of chaos damage.
They're both cargo cult pieces of shit, so...
Well, I never did understand why the Sonic franchise was so dumb, because they had, like, the 2D games were at least kind of like you could evolve
because
that.
it's literally, and they're on record saying this, it is literally designed for Americans. It is all about catering to the American market.
What,
So when you think about how the Japanese
ones?
actually think about Americans, look no further than Sonic. And it's a very, very, very focused marketed thing.
Don't you think it's funny that, like, they basically... I kind of think about this as, like, a funny premise for some meme map crap or something, maybe. But, like, after World War II, the Japanese have all of these military camps of America, like, in their country. And I just like to imagine that all of their marketers, like, based their assumption of what the American populace is based on those military camps instead of actually what the American populace is. Like, just imagine them, like, trying to advertise as a result of that. Like, that would be like if aliens had, like, they found, like, I don't know, like a Jocko Willink or some, like, ex-Navy SEALs guy or whatever, and they're like, yeah, bro, this must be what all humans are like, so let's just market towards that. And then they just, like, come out with the most absurd things. And that just takes me all the way back to Nova Covert Ops, where there's an upgrade you can, or some equipment you could give your Marines, and it was called Super Stimpaku. And I was like, couldn't believe that, dude. Like, what the fuck? So... yeah, there you go. That's how we open this one in. We talk about fucking memes. I do think you could do something with that premise. That's a free idea. I do. You know what? Before we get into the central topic today, I actually have a random, totally unconnected thought to run by you. I have been feeling for a while now, and I know you'll agree with this. I know you'll agree with this to some degree because I kind of know how you ideate certain ideas and stuff. Like you come up with ideas for your world, and you said before you can just sort of like snap your fingers and like come up with a bunch of character backstories and motivations and all this other stuff. So, do you agree then that the like having an idea itself is pretty overrated? Like people get really confused and concerned. I mean, there's the whole meme of like, I need an idea guy for my project or whatever. Like that should be you though. Like that should be you. What the fuck is going on here? So that's a meme. But like, I still think that most people feel like, oh, if they have one good idea, then they have to like hide it and they have to keep it to themselves. They can't ever fucking explain it or whatever. It's like, to me,
OC,
that's like,
please don't steal.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know. I just think about that and I think, you know, I have loads of ideas. I will never be able to execute on every idea that I have because I just have so many fucking ideas. I have this overabundance of them. Please, somebody take them and just do something with them so that, like, at least I can see somebody's, reference of it or whatever. That would be more my angle. If I was going to do anything about my ideas, it would be giving as many away as possible because I'm not going to be able to get to them all. I don't know if you come down on it in any one way, but to me, it's funny when people are like, OC, don't steal, basically, like you said. It's just so silly.
Well, I don't run into this often because for some reason most of the people I talk to are not really creatively inclined. But I do see, as I'm going through OC, please don't steal for my D&D art, I end up coming across a bunch of people who are like, hey, I commissioned all this art, but now I gotta sell it. So I'm just gonna sell my OC, please don't steal. Okay. And then... it just is really funny when I come across that because there was one in particular I came across for that. And it got me thinking, I was thinking, you can't really sell an idea. That doesn't really work.
Yeah.
But then what is an idea? An idea is just this amorphous blob. Like, for most ideas are just ideas. They don't mean anything unless they amalgamate to something. Now, in this particular context, they did amalgamate into art, which presumably they have like high resolution PSDs for they're selling. But that's being marketed as being, oh, I'm selling this character and then all the art related to it. It's like, well, you can't really sell the character. Like, you can just do what I'm doing. You can just right click, download LMAO, you're done. You can make something with it. You can do something with it. You can copy paste the entire character idea, and they literally can't do a goddamn thing about it.
Yeah.
And I haven't, like, personally, I haven't seen the whole, hey, we need an idea guide kind of thing for the projects. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of projects do need that, because when I look at like Immortal or Stormgate or any of these other meme Reddit tier games, it is so obvious just right off from the gate that they have no idea.
Yeah.
There is not a single shred of creativity in their entire team whatsoever. Like, before, I thought it was just, oh, they just got to ride Blizzard's dick because Blizzard made Warcraft 3, and Warcraft 3's art, quote unquote, style is so clever and catchy and lazy that you can just copy paste it without actually investing into an art team. So now everybody has to copy paste it, but now it's like 20 years later, and I'm still scratching my head and like, hasn't anybody even bothered to try something different yet? And then you realize, no, people are actually only capable of cargo cult. They aren't actually capable of thinking for themselves anymore. And the more that I read Fagudo screenshots and other garbage that Luciferius vomits into our laps, like a cat that goes out in the fucking yard and finds the most decrepit dead bird to puke on you, you know, you just start getting hit with this realization that, holy shit, everybody really is just this stupid. And like, a lot of the people that I talked to, that I wouldn't describe them as creative individuals, but that's because they weren't really individuals who were doing writing or building their own worlds or stuff like that. But they were usually people who still had some like technical ideas of what they wanted to do, or approaches. Like, you gotta find the right nipple to tickle. And it's still such a massive contrast to all these Reddit hacks. You go to them and you find their products, like, again, Immortal Stormgate really just stand out as being like these people who are trying to take something that they feel didn't succeed or didn't quite represent a vision well enough, which in this case would be StarCraft 2, because they're both butt blasted that Blizzard is so successful and they're not.
Yeah.
And their whole premise is about learning from that and evolving from that, but they always regress every single time, and then they make their entire product about being related to StarCraft 2 instead of being about their vision, because they don't actually have a vision. They got out, they managed to dupe all these investors into giving them money, because investors are even dumber somehow. And then they have all these resources. They can literally make anything they want. Anything they want. The sky's the limit. When you've got $1 million, you can do anything you want. What do? They do this. They do the exact same thing, except worse. Lower quality, lower production values, no standards, and then like the writing and the characters and everything like that is just the most like mobile phone copy paste generic NetEase shit you can get your hands onto. Like, you can't throw a fucking stone out the window without it hitting some random app on Google Play that looks identical to these products, has an identical premise, identical appearance, identical sound, identical looking user interface. They all look the fucking same. They all blend amongst each other because they're all the same grifter shit. And that's supposed to be, you know, every now and then throughout my life, I've heard statements akin to, oh, wow, indie developers are so creative because they have no restrictions. So here I am waiting for a creative indie developer to show up all my fucking life. And it hasn't happened yet. The closest you really get is like Dwarf Fortress, but, well, then they had to pander to terrorist organizations, and to hell with them. So, the people just apparently are not capable of making ideas. When an idea is literally just, you don't even look at the context of things around you. Like, the entire premise of game software is just, you got to do something because this guy did it and it was successful. Herder. Well, it's not even an idea. That's literally just being lazy. That's all anyone is just lazy. There is no ideas. Like, ideas often fail. Most ideas will fail more often than they will succeed. Even if you execute them very well, they're still going to fail. That's the whole point of ideas, is you put them to the test, but you don't see people really doing that. Every now and then you get, you know, like that one guy on your server who's posting this, it was on Steam, and I know Veek was playing it. What's
Rerun the game, yeah. It's like a pixel art style turn-based game.
That was a little different, right? Like, there was some ideas in that, so that's what kind of got my attention about that, even though it's not normally my kind of game. But, like, the most of these pixel art games that I see is literally just, like, LMAO items and numbers and clicker heroes and The turn-based shit in general has been really depressing for the last 20 years because it's just been. I mean, you look at Age of Wonders 2 and they had like 15 and 16 races. Most of them are just recolors of each other, but nobody even bothers to even attempt to do that anymore. So it's gross, honestly. And like you could take that idea and you can work off of it, but they would rather regress instead. Like regression, it's always about regression, about simplification, and it's masqueraded as accessibility because in order to make something accessible, you got to make it absolutely dumb and mundane as bricks, because you got to treat your players as literal toddlers who are too stupid to think for themselves, too stupid to read stuff on the screens, too stupid to put A and B together. Now, that is a very fair assessment, right? Looking at the Canadian education system, it's a very fair assessment to assume that most people over the age of 30 have the mental development of a toddler. It's very much the case. Just look at our prime minister. And you know, the games have to be built for that because you got to have mass appeal to be monetarily successful. There's another meme that you see a lot that fuels all this is you have to be accessible to be successful. So every now and then I see people who may have had an idea, but then it turns into absolute horseshit because some marketer told them, yeah, you gotta be accessible. That's not very accessible. Thinking is not really the end thing in today's market. You gotta keep up with today's market. Now, a lot of these games that turn out to be absolute rancid horseshit, again, like Sonic, StarCraft, so on, they have ideas in them that were neat. You can often, a lot of the times in my review process, I can find something even in the most rancid of titles that you can encapsulate as, hey, this was a neat idea.
Yep.
If it was executed on well, that's great. But the other problem with ideas is when you're dealing with, especially commercial software, again, immoral, so on, you are looking at extremely unwieldy large teams of people who do not coexist well. Their production environment is a hopscotch mess at the absolute best of times. Ideas get watered down. Each and every single individual person you introduce into the development side of a project waters down, distills, and destroys the representation of another person's ideas every single time. Let's take, for example, StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2 has concept art because most of these games do have concept art for the purpose of selling art books. When you look at the concept art and then you look at the in-game assets, there is actually no relationship between them whatsoever. They're completely unrelated. Now, it's hard for me to say if they actually even looked at the concept art in production, but the general gut instinct that I get is that nobody looked at the concept art. But I also think there's a very real possibility that because there is so many limbs to the body, that maybe Joe Sixpack, the guy doing the original sculpts, if they had an original sculpt, which they didn't because they used DeviantArt and they just made a bunch of blocks and that was it. But conceptually speaking, if you make the original sculpt, then the sculpt's got to go through the low poly process and then actual integration into the engine to some extent. But these companies are so massively subdivided, you often have a different person making the textures, a different person doing the actual model, a different person doing the animations, even a different person even doing the original sculpt. You know, you look at the credits for any single one of these low-tier games, they're absolutely massive. They're just hundreds of people working in just art alone. And it's just like, even if these people are all buddies with each other and they've all worked with each other for 10, 20 years, every single thing gets distilled, it becomes more about efficiency than about expression. And you can't express yourself amidst a crowd. It's just not going to happen. So if the initial guy doing the sculpt was actually pursuing the original concept art, now it's got another layer of abstraction, which is his interpretation of that. And then you got another guy doing whatever work after. There's another interpretation of that. Then you got the guy doing the textures. You got maybe even the subdivided more. You know, with Blizzard, I can see them trying to make like this huge factory with each individual stop where they have a separate person doing the UV wrapping. They have a separate person doing the normal maps. You have a separate person doing any masking, like the player color. You have a separate person doing the particles. Like all this needless subdivision that just adds more links to the chain, more points of failure, more regression.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that exactly what we always say about big companies, is that the more employees you have, the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the more bloated your whole process is. Now you got to deal with all of the administrative bloat because you need to keep track of them, and then you need to like get group of approval for a bunch of decisions and stuff.
And then you look at the end result. Look at the end result with StarCraft 2. It is a disaster. The graphics has got to be some of the worst 3D graphics that have been developed since Bubsy 3D. It is a train wreck, and yet it performs so badly. And they sunk so much money into it, and it was just DeviantArt garbage, just complete refuse. This stuff would never make it into an internal demo in a respectable corporation, but there are no respectable corporations because everybody thinks this is the way you've got to do things because it's supposedly faster. But that's also debunked because look at the development length for these games. For the amount of content they produce, they should be able to produce these titles every couple months at the absolute most because they're not actually building anything. It's just all kit bashes. It's all copy paste. Blizzard is still using the same alpha rigs in World of Warcraft to this day. There's no actual development going on. It's just a bunch of corner cutting, rug sweeping, and other lunacy. So let's say in World of Warcraft you had an idea for a unique creature or something like that, but again, bureaucracy, gotta cut the corners, gotta watch our budgets because we gotta heat our building with dollar bills. We can't do that. So let's just reuse something from back in alpha, that fucking white skeleton and rig. Jesus Christ, why do they keep using that? And then the ideas are lost. Maybe they had like some colors or some texture representation of something that made it into the final product from some initial concept written out. But then the initial ideas for the guy who made the concept are gone.
Yeah.
As far as
just get washed
concerned,
out, lost in translation from all the different attempts at, trying to filter out through so many people. I mean, the number of things too, especially since communication is never strong in any of these companies. And that's the thing that you would need the most attention paid to because you're dealing with so many potential spots where the link can be broken or somebody will, it's like the Chinese telephone. Like you whisper something into some dude's ear and then he goes to do it to somebody else. And then like at the end of the day, the sentence is completely different than what it started out because it just gets scrambled. And like, that's definitely a huge issue with these big companies. But I just think of it like, think about the amount of things that like even just in Apex X, you send me the first voyage. There's like a number of things that I would either think are bugs or unintentional, but are intentional, like the lighting or whatever. When I was like, I thought like it was unintentional for it to be so dark in one area, and then I was like, that's kind of weird. And then when you said, oh no, that's the point, I was like, oh okay, that's fine. But like I had to know that, right? And I'm just a player. And then like the things that maybe were bugs, but I didn't notice immediately as bugs or something. But it's kind of going the other way around, where like if I'm an artist working under somebody else, I'm a technical artist. I think something's like a mistake or an omission, and I fix it in air quotes, or I think something's intentional when it should be fixed, and I don't fix it. Like either one of those results in like something meaningfully different than what we were expecting the end result would be based on you passing me an asset or whatever in this analogy. So it definitely gets so silly the more people you have involved in it. I think. Again, it's good if you're trying to be an assembly line, a factory, like you're describing it, where you can just pump out game after game after game, but also they can't do that. So evidently they cannot produce like, shit tier fucking Nova Covert Ops content in single player or anything. Like for how long the game has existed, the amount of content that doesn't exist, it's staggering. It's like the amount of content that StarCraft 2 doesn't have is so fucking insane. like
when you go through the assets and you're familiar with like the commercial CDs they use, you know the general process for making the assets. StarCraft 2 is actually bewildering at how lazy it is. It's bewildering.
Well, and think about all the default settings and default configurations they did wrong for their own things. Like you think about like obviously there's some meshes and stuff that are totally fucked, like the Goliath, but like, think about all the specularity on the Zerg. Think about all the stuff that you have to, like, basically step in and fix. Like, it's way worse. In StarCraft 1, there's a number of things that you have to step in and fix if you're starting from scratch. There's actually quite a large number of things you can't do without reverse engineering. But even in terms of, like, an asset basis, like...
Well, the StarCraft 1 stuff is kind of different, though. Like, StarCraft 1's, a lot of the asset problems are because of their weird development life, but also you get stuff like the Carrier, where it's like they went out of their way to do stuff weird.
Yes.
Like, a lot of effort went into doing it wrong. In StarCraft 2, there was just no effort at all. There's a difference. And
the difference really I would say is also in terms of magnitude. Like, StarCraft 2 has way more shit wrong with it. Even though, like, I'm not saying Brood War is super solid and great in that respect, but, like, they just... it's sort of like in the campaign missions, they could only butcher the formula so hard with the shitty tools that they had at their disposal in Brood War.
Yeah.
And then when Warcraft 3 comes around and StarCraft 2 comes around, now they can do way more creative things. and
the fact that Warcraft 3 was commercially successful was one of the greatest disasters of the gaming industry. It was a real turning point for just general quality, ethics, and just like end results. Warcraft 3 was a huge turning point where just everything went straight to shit afterwards.
Right. There's some walking simulator game. I think it might have been Dear Esther or something like that. But I distinctly remember the author of whatever game I'm thinking of having said something to the effect of like, well, I could have written a poem, but it wouldn't have been successful, so I made it a game. And it's basically admitting that, like, yeah, the standards for, like, writing are really low in the games industry, so you can do something that would be, like, really basic bitch tier in another medium. Like, oh, that's really, like, we're more sophisticated than that now in, poetry or books or whatever. Meanwhile, if you're trying to do it in the games industry, like, look at the stories that succeed in the games industry. Like, like anything from Blizzard, for example. And, again, the fact that, I think I brought this up in the last episode, but the fact that when I was doing some research in preparation for the potential, I don't know, that guy's still on vacation probably, the potential interview with that guy from the Immortal development team. And I was like, okay, well, these guys actually do believe that. I mean, on the one hand, it's cool that they believe StarCraft 2 is a failure in some ways and that they had some ideas to improve it. But on the other hand, like, they're
not really working hard to improve it.
Well, the fact that they also in the same sort of breath say, but the Blizzard campaigns defined the genre and really are super epic. And it's like,
I mean, they defined it, just that's not necessarily a positive thing.
No, they defined it as
they made sure the borrow quality was just barrel bottom.
Yeah. Yeah, to the point where it's really not that difficult to make something better. Like, so
it's an
easy.
absolute embarrassment.
And this is something that always gets me. Like, I think now, being a little introspective, when I was raging at the fact that people were just like making shittier versions of the default campaigns as their custom campaigns, and I was like trying to tell these guys, like, no, you're doing it wrong, like completely wrong. Blizzard did it wrong. You have to admit Blizzard had no idea what they were doing, and then that's how you do better than them. You don't do better than them by saying I can't do better than them. They're too good. Like, what the fuck? So like they always frame it like, oh, let's just try really hard and invariably fail at doing something as good as how epic the Blizzard campaigns are. Meanwhile, it's like the easiest thing to just not be that bad. You just, have some AI that actually can test you and stuff. And like, you can do something that is bare bones and maybe like obviously kind of jank because Brood War's jank, but it'll still be better than anything else that you're going to find. And that's enough. Like, that's at least enough for a start. Like, at least then you can start to say, like, well, what do I need differently? And then you pretty quickly come to the conclusion you probably need to make your own engine or whatever if you're, make your own game if you're going to try to, do something super significantly better. But you can at least be somewhat better, like, definitively better, even if it's just a couple of steps in the right direction. You don't have to run a fucking marathon here. You just have to get us back on track. And nobody's doing that. Like,
nope.
There's not really, I can't think of any campaigns that were actually better than the default ones, and the default ones were pretty fucking terrible. So,
yeah, Brood War was a real shit show. That whole campaign was just so disgusting.
Yeah, you've actually kind of played it recently, so
Yeah, I did the LP for it, so it was. Even when I was young, very very young, I ended up cheating through the campaigns because they were so bland. And like, as a child, I knew there was something distinctly wrong with the campaigns were done. I always tended to skirmish. And I never, there's no way I could put words to those thoughts when I was a child. But when I was a child, 11, how old was I back then? It was 11, 12, 13 years old, something around there, 1998? Yeah, something like that. Mm-hmm. So it was something that I just felt back then is that something is wrong with the campaigns. They're not interesting. The characters are the premise got me a lot. The setting was very interesting because I hadn't experienced Warhammer at the time, so I didn't know it was just a ripoff of Warhammer. But the characters were so awful and the mission designs were so unengaging that even as a kid, as a target audience, I just felt that. And I just moved on eventually to creating my own content. Even as a kid, I just knew that something was just inherently wrong with the way things were being done in these products. So, you know, I don't think there is any excuse for any person to not look to improve beyond that. And maybe you have an idea that's similar, but you can always look at the execution and be like, well, the execution for this was abysmally bad, so how can I do better?
Yeah.
But people are actually allergic to doing better. The self-improvement is ableist and racist these days.
Got him.
And
I just feel like it's personally not super interesting for me to be like, let's just go and remake this like somebody else's idea. But
that's all anyone does, though.
Well, at the same time, if you were to go ahead and do that and say, this is what I'm doing, okay, great. Like, do that, but do it well. Like, remake it better. Like, make it so that there was a reason for it to exist. You know, it maybe that reason is just, oh, it's a private project and, you know, I'm practicing and I'm learning skills. And it's not actually going to be better, but it'll be, you know, teaching me some things. And, like, the things I did slightly different, the slight differences are going to educate me. And actually, in some ways, that's CMBW, right? Or whatever. That's, like, any of the work that we've done in modding is, like, what if we do something different than the original game did? And what are the end results of that, right? And like, what are the ramifications of these harvesting changes we've done, and about resource gathering and all this other stuff? Like, what's that look like? And yeah, it's just, I don't understand why people don't think about that a little bit more deeply and actually try to do that a little bit more thoughtfully, because it's just like I can't quite comprehend why it's like that. Like, why people just don't have ideas, and if they don't have ideas, why they decide, let me just make like the same thing as somebody else but worse. And that's definitely, both of those things have been encapsulated with my time with StarCraft custom campaigns, and more increasingly actually as I'm playing StarCraft clones from like Korea and shit. It's like I played a lot of those recently, and so many of them really are just like, yeah, this is StarCraft but worse. And like the interesting,
well, it's just like
ideas.
Their Counter-Strike clones. They have Counter-Strike clones too.
Yeah, that's right, like Crossfire and stuff. And I just think like, okay, well, you have these ideas that are exactly the same as the default ideas, and then you have a couple of ideas that are maybe kind of different. But there's like a few of them that are just absolutely like broken. Like I know in Replica Atomic Punk, I think Voyager sent me a screenshot of him like rallying a transport, and it just got stuck in the terrain or something, and like a like a dropship equivalent or whatever. And he's like, yeah, this game is pretty functional or something. I was like, so like, you know, I'm sure there's some science you can do in that, but like if it's buggier than Brood War, that's a fucking statement and a half. Like, probably needed a little bit more time in the oven, so to speak. But you know, whatever. Some of these are really obscure things too, so it's pretty interesting to try to research them on that front. But it's like, these are at least people who wanted to do, like, they wanted their own version of StarCraft or whatever. And, you know, that's kind of what I said about Five Nations when I played it, is like, he wanted his own version of Protoss as a race, and his own version of Zerg as a race. And it's like, all right, yeah, I guess he's got it, but maybe it would be cool to have, I mean, his ideas were worse than the default, so maybe that's a bit different. But, like, wouldn't it be better if they were just something you couldn't immediately relate to other shit? And I guess one of his other races is literally the same name as like a Battlestar Galactica race that I'm not familiar with, the Cylon.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, nice.
Are they robots?
Yeah.
Oh, then they are literally copy-pasted
They're
from...
complete automata, yeah. They I forget all the details now, but it's like they used to be... like they turned themselves into robots to save themselves from extinction or something. I don't know if that...
Oh, that's actually literally the inverse of Battlestar Galactica. It's identical. Wow, golly.
Yeah, so there you go.
Very creative. Then again, Five Nations had a lot of very questionable design decisions, and then starting with using Chrome of all things. Yeah. Absolutely haram.
I still like the load-bearing memory leak
Oh, you know, I just don't like when you reach that point, don't you just kind of stop and think, have I done something wrong with my life to end up in this situation? Like, there's been some wrong turns here. Maybe you should just kind of like put it down, take a step back, and reassess where you're sitting in this grand spectacle that is life, and maybe consider it's time to just start over completely from scratch and do it right, maybe.
And that's why they're going to switch to Unity.
Yeah, that's not how you do it. There is literally no case at all for Unity. You can't make a case for it in any way at all. Not for any genre, not for any product. You're literally paying more for basic features that Unreal has. Not that Unreal is going to be better for this kind of thing in general, but it will perform better. There are more resources, and you're not paying out the ass for unproven subsystems like networking, for example. You get something that is battle tested and well proven because it's the exact same thing within like Fortnite, right? So
yeah, I
you
wonder
basically
about that.
are getting billions of dollars of development for free.
Right. Well, that part is definitely true. I have seen Mr. Z post about some very entertaining.
Yeah, his shits. I'm not sure what his system looks like. I'm like wondering why he's having issues with the physics, but it's just whatever he's doing that's running into. I mean, I run into shit with physics too right now. There's still some issue with chaos where I think it's causing Rama's hit traces to fail sometimes. And he has a note in there that chaos is not working well, and there's a bug of some kind, and he can't do anything about it. But these are all experimental systems too, so you kind of go in there with the knowledge that there's going to be problems and limitations. Right now, we're on the development branch for 5.2, and there's a bunch of weird issues with shadows and some other stuff. HKS has been trying to get Steam sockets to work for the D&D client so that we can connect through Steam and mask our IP and shit, but that has never worked, and he can't find any information about it. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement, absolutely. And again, like a lot of the stuff we are dealing with, however, is experimental kind of shit that you just kind of like, what you're walking into. With Unity, you get worse quality, and then you actually have to pay up front for it. So it's the devil the devil you don't, or you make your own engine, which you can absolutely do. I think for every project that I've seen on this server, making your own engine is absolutely viable, including for Renown. It just, again, it really depends on your skill level. Like, are you skilled enough to do this? Then you should probably do this. And you can most certainly find a lot of resources on the internet for doing a lot of the shit that this stuff does. I mean, if you know low-level understanding of Unreal, chances are you can just make those changes to Unreal at the low level. Then you don't have to make your engine, but you can strip out a lot of the stuff in Unreal. Absolutely. But then you have to kind of know what you're doing. Most people don't. So they go to Unity because they think Unity is more beginner-friendly, because a part of the marketing thing for Unity has been to gaslight people into thinking that Unreal is hard to get into, when it's actually really quite the opposite. Because with Unity, you're dealing with mostly third-party systems. Like the netcode, again, there's nothing that's ever going to be super easy about netcode. Netcode is always going to be something that you're going to have to learn. And it's probably one of the more complicated things, because first you have to learn how to make a game. Now you have to learn how to make it work in netcode. And I'm already being interrupted again. Jesus Christ.
Absolute destruction.
Yeah, so netcode is definitely one of the big things to get into, because it's not just about knowing when to transmit information, but also, how much information to transmit, making it secure. Obviously, Mr. Z is running into some issues where he's trying to make sure that it's fairly secure against cheaters, and that's where a lot of complications are coming up for him. So that's always going to be a challenge. Like, that's always going to be something you're going to have to get into. With Unity, you're doing it with unproven third-party systems that have not been really tested under high load for the most part. And the only metrics you have to go by for Unity in terms of successful games with netcode is like Genshin Impact, where the netcode is so bad, the rubber banding and desyncing is just absolutely insane, to the point that they just abandoned co-op early into their development, and it still exists as a meme, and that's about it. And let's see, Honkai Impact, which is also super desync heavy. It's probably using the exact same netcode as Genshin because it's the same developer. And various phone games and shit like that all perform abysmally bad. Every single one of these games has atrocious performance. That's the only consistency of the Unity is how bad the performance is. And they all don't use netcode at all. They opt out of it. And that's not including the fact that Unity has DRM. That is, as far as I know, you can't really get rid of unless you have a license, maybe. Whereas in Unreal, you get the full source code right away. So, in terms of like going into stuff, making an engine or whatever, because Unreal just gives you full source access. Anytime people come to me and say, "Oh, it's I can't do this or that in it," I'm like, well, you weren't going to do this or that in a custom engine anyways, because you obviously don't have the skills to work with a source. That is very often that's always kind of been the case ever since Unreal came out. Is giving people full source access kind of changes a lot, because the vast majority of people who like that I know personally, the extreme majority of people that I talked to over the years who were talking about making games, getting into game development, and we're looking either at making an engine, there was only a few of them, or using something like, in many cases, like back in the day, it was more source. There was I mentioned this before, there's a lot of people that were interested in making source-related projects. They were idea guys. Those were the idea guys.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so I should mention when I was referencing idea guys earlier, like, a big part of, like, idea guy was a derogative term for a person who wouldn't do any actual effort or learn any actual skills, but was like, precisely can everybody else just do all this work for me? Because I think my ideas are really epic, yeah.
That's the kind of people I'm talking about. Is I still have a ton of their concept art lying around. There was Hercanic, and then there was Dark Omen, two different people. Apparently Dark Omen went on a huge spurg about Donald Trump and got himself ousted out of a bunch of places. So he's also Canadian, so he probably has a lot of that, degenerative genetics going on. He was a very interesting fellow, Dark Omen. He was the guy who tried to teach me music composition and eventually gave up because I'm too stupid, because I'm also Canadian, and he would put two Canadians in the same room. It's just a vortex of insanity. And he went from, let me try to pace it in my head. So he was early into music. We're talking like early 2000s. And he was technically very proficient. I feel like I'm rehashing a story I told before. But he was the idea guy where he had ideas for music, but he couldn't execute them. And he obviously felt some degree of frustration with that because he moved away from it. He went into programming. And then, as far as I last heard from him, which was some years ago now, he went back into music composition. So he actually went into programming. As far as I know, he was actually doing something related to a StarCraft 2 fan site. And I'm sure that's probably why he abandoned programming, because StarCraft 2 just has this way of sucking people's enjoyment out of everything. So I'm sure that's what happened for him. I don't know what he's doing today, but he had all these ambitions for a shooter in Source. He was kind of the person who got me caught up in that hype early on into my life of making an actual game, because there was a lot of related talks about that, and he was showing his concept art and stuff like that. He had Hercanic, who was very similar. I think they talked a lot, so they probably all got caught up in each other's shit. So really, like, you get like two idea guys talking to each other about, hey, wouldn't it be neat if we did that? We could do this, you could do that. Hey, your project is like this, mine would be like this, yada, yada, yada. None of them ever actually had any hope in hell of actually setting foot inside Hammer or anything like that and actually getting anything done. As far as I know, either of them ever only got as far as making like concept edits of screenshots, and that's absolutely it. Whereas I went on into working with Unreal 2004 to an extent. HKS made a mod for us in Unreal 99. We actually brushed shoulders with those kinds of tool sets quite a bit. He got into Hammer. He actually made some really silly maps for Counter-Strike and shit like that I showed you guys in that one Counter-Strike video way back.
Yep.
Just hacking up existing maps. I mean, that was still more than what these people did. And and then I tried to get into other stuff as well. And then there was the other guy I talked to. He's probably one of the most major influences on, what I know of these subjects in general, is the reverse engineer who's worked with like Diablo 2 and stuff like that. And he's been at this stuff for a really, really long time.
I was going to say, one of the things that you settle yourself in for if you're going to make a new engine or do any really big reverse engineering task, or probably anything really large scale in general, is you are looking at a multi-year affair most of the time.
He's been at it for a long time.
Yeah. I mean,
a very, very long time.
I say this with full knowledge that we're trying to ship a game this year and stuff. No. But like, we have been working at Antikythera, not the entire way through, not like as our prime like task the entire way through the last couple of years, but we've been working at it for a while. And even if we release like a game, it's not like we're done, right? Like the whole point is that Antikythera serves as this stepping stone for many games, right? It's like look at so basically what you were saying, funnily enough, about like you see StarCraft 2 and the lack of content, despite the fact that it seems really, really fucking trivial to make. If you're going to say that that's your bar of quality, you can make stuff that's like, at the very least, at that bar of quality, incredibly easily. So,
I was able to, so why not anyone else?
Right. I mean, your stuff I even saw down to your like Marine redo and your Battlecruiser redo. Like these were things that, maybe somebody more experienced than us in the realm of 3D could do them quite easily, but regardless of how long it took, it's like, yeah, that's easily better than the default. So like if you can do that and, like you're a modder basically in that moment, then what's stopping the actual fucking company from doing that? But even if they are not going to go higher than that bar of quality, they can at least continue to make stuff. Like, that's just something that I don't understand why people don't fucking do, is actually make content, or anything. Like when we release our first game, I mean, I don't know how much content it's going to have at release, but we're not going to do paid expansion packs for this game. It's just going to, if we come up with more content, we can just launch it there. But our idea is, listen, it's not going to take that much, that many resources to produce a campaign, like especially once we actually have all of the environment art done and like the engine mapping stuff taken care of. We've done a lot of progress on like making that a bit more usable now for actually painting terrain and stuff. And okay, like when we have that, and when we have like whatever system we decide to do for our AI customization and our, that sort of thing, we don't need to make new races at that point, and we don't need to make new environment assets necessarily, or unit assets or whatever. We just, as a result, all we have to do is make maps. Dude, we can make like fucking 50 hours worth of content in single player or whatever really easily. Mm-hmm. It's not like, not to say that it would be assembly line really low quality content, quite the opposite, because our design philosophy actually lends towards RTS gameplay, shockingly enough, in the fucking environment of building out an RTS campaign. But it's just like, I just don't understand. I'm with you. Like, how do you not produce a lot of content? How do you not just shower the people with ridiculous amounts of content? Like Age of Empires 2 and similar games from that franchise apparently get like new campaigns a lot, and I think they're all paid DLC, which is stupid because the campaigns are never any good. So it's not like you're like being paid to get pissed on, which is, I guess, most gaming at this point. But like, you don't need to go to see my.
No wonder OnlyFans is so popular.
You don't need to go see my uncle
and there's so much
down the street and have him dribble the fucking jars. You can just, just actually have real content. Like it's not hard, man. Like the fact that Age of Empires 2 gets paid every single time they release like 2 new campaigns, and they're really bad, and like they're not really full of content. Like their idea of a new race is somebody with 3 different upgrades and 3 different unit types than the other guy. Like, why? Why is that why is that what blows our mind these days? Like, okay, how about a new campaign that's like 10 missions long and takes you, 10 to 20 hours to beat because it's actually challenging and it has actual, RTS gameplay in it. Like, how about that? Isn't that epic? Like, wouldn't you like that every so often instead of fucking paid DLC for grind and RPG?
It's been mechanics? A methodical gaslight. This has been marketing at work, is to condition the market in such a way where they are willing to accept less for more. And it's been very, very successful in the games industry. Very successful. I would argue it's been successful in just about every industry, but the games industry is particularly a great example of that at work.
I think it's a great example because it doesn't require, like, many people still think of games as toys, and at this point, fair enough. But like, because we're not talking about like something really much, like significantly impactful on the day-to-day life. I mean, you can make an argument that like if you're willing to settle for less in your entertainment life, then you're probably making concessions elsewhere in life too. And so maybe it's a microcosm or a symptom of like a bigger problem or whatever. But like most people think, oh, your games are bad. Well, whatever. There's bigger problems. but at the same time, because we're not talking about like how education is so terrible and how everything else is so terrible, even though it's all linked, it's like, yeah, but if you can point to it in the games field that like people have just been accepting like worse quality products for and paying more for it or whatever, then maybe that opens their eyes to the other ways in their life that they are doing that. So it still can be used as a really great like lightning rod type example for like, hey dude, wake up sheeple, like look at the shit you're paying for. Look at the idea, like think about the fact that most people are testing games when they come out instead of like actually playing a product. Like they are paying for the privilege of testing a game, bug testing a game. Like at the same, like just the gall that developers have now to be like, we see you've crashed. Can you send us a bug report? Like, fuck you, buddy. Why would I spend my time playing a defective product and then helping you fix it? That's your job. Like, your job is to give me a product that isn't defective. And if it has some defections, to fix it. Like, what the fuck is this? What reality is this where I'm like going out of my way to help the developer finish the game that I paid them for?
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff that should be happening during the engine development with Unreal. Like Unreal, the bug report thing is very useful because it makes sense that you're developing an engine, you're trying to broadly apply it to, as many platforms as possible on as much hardware as possible. I run into issues HKS doesn't have because I'm using a card from 2017. So I do the process of the bug reporting.
Yeah, sure.
And that makes sense. Certainly from a shipped product perspective, I'm definitely not opposed to the whole idea of the whole bug report thing. But the thing is that the bugs that we encounter is not the kind of bugs you should be encountering in modern software or any software at all. Because like it makes sense that there's some kind of like hardware fault in the engine that like some unique combination because because of the way the driver economics and infrastructure looks now. Is a lot of game developers think they should have driver access, and they shouldn't. And as things have evolved and games become more and more unstable, is because developers are doing things that they shouldn't do. And driver manufacturers are trying to unfuck the things that developers do. When you see a lot of these driver updates for like these massive performance games and engines, a lot of the case is because the drivers are unfucking shit that the developers are trying to do because they don't understand what the fuck they're doing. And, I can absolutely understand that there's problems with that. But, shit with like Warcraft, everything in Warcraft 3, for example, all the innumerable bugs with the pathing and stuff like that shouldn't happen. But
no, it's like a basic thing you find out when you're using your units for the first time as a developer. And it just goes back to that one little, like, that one-liner my brother fired off one day where he was like, when I make a game, the first thing I do is play my game. How the fuck did these bugs show up in products? Like, yeah, that's the question. It's like if it's a hardware thing, then you wouldn't maybe get it, right? And that's a different case. But if it's like, yeah, let me just like not be able to use my units from a fundamental, like 5 Nations. First of all, I couldn't even fucking run 5 Nations for 2 years. So it's a pretty like really bad example. But on the same time, it's like, bro, your units get stuck and your solution is to just freeze them forever and I can't use them anymore. Like, and it happens like every map at least once. And then you like obviously have the load bearing memory leak bit. It's like, you guys know that maybe this game isn't functional and you're developing DLC instead of fixing these bugs. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, but I mean, like years ago, it was the meme that games are sold unfinished for early money. And it was derogatory to view it as such. But then early access became a thing. And then they just, instead of like improving their products, they turned it into another marketing point instead. And that kind of really tells you a lot about the direction that marketing has taken gaming in general. Marketing has just been such a disaster for games. Meritocracy is the only thing that works in any kind of production environment at all whatsoever. I was trying to remember what the fuck it was I was going to say. Oh, yeah. Generally speaking, I find people who are willing to make concessions in entertainment are the exact same kind of people who are willing to make concessions elsewhere in their life.
Yeah.
That has been the case for all the developers I know. It's been the case for all the game players I know, is that people who are usually willing to settle for less are willing to settle for less elsewhere and tend to live unfulfilling lives. This is very, very often the case. For example, it's been the case with pretty much every StarCraft 2 developer I've ever met. And a lot of these people just are miserable. They're absolutely miserable, and they're willing to accept being miserable, and they're willing to accept a lot of things that people should just not accept. And like the guy doing the Diablo 2 work and other stuff like that, he is also making his own engine as well. And I have a lot of respect for that guy because of his long-term dedication. Absolutely. There's been a few people that I've brushed shoulders with that they got partway through and then lost steam and gave up or something like that. But this guy, he's had a lot of shit happen all throughout his life, of course. He has a lot of stuff going on. He, of course, has to work as well. And sometimes he goes for months to even like a year or two without really being able to make much progress on this project. But then he just comes back to it. And that is one in, I would say, 1 in a billion that can do something like that. Because it's not something you see within commercial work at all. All commercial stuff has a very high turnout. And it's definitely something you never see in custom content at all, especially from the communities that I've been a part of, Homeworld and Sins and so on. There just is not people who really have the dedication to actually do good work and then stick to it over a long period of time. They usually just give up on custom content entirely instead of moving on to another engine. That's actually something else I've really noticed too, is that usually when people give up on something, on like a mod or something like that, they actually stop making custom content entirely. They don't move on to something else. It's very, very rare for that to actually happen, which is kind of interesting because I think usually the reason for that is what got them into it to begin with is because they had a derivative / cargo cult idea to begin with, and that doesn't translate to another product or another engine, and so they just abandon the whole thing entirely.
I feel like that's definitely happened before, where basically whatever they were going for just isn't, like, they get overly attached to their one idea that probably isn't that good anyway, and if they can't execute on that, they just fall into this like depression.
Or they realize it's not good is very often the case.
Oh yeah, that could also be the case where it's like they get part of the way there to implementing it, and then or even all the way, and then they find out like, oh, actually it was not a good idea. I mean, think about all the times we've walked back stuff in CMBW. It's like, well, we had this idea, and for whatever reason we thought it was good, and then it wasn't when we actually executed on it. And like we have to decide like, okay, is there a way this idea could still be good, and it's just that we didn't execute well, or like, is this just not the right fit? Like, so many ideas I have for things get really stupid when it comes to stacking. Like you were seeing this convolesque fucking stuff, for example, and it's like, yeah, because units can stack up when decolliding, and because air units can stack, and because workers can stack while harvesting, it's like all of this shit results in just really untenable fucking cases where like, yeah, now I have to deal with all of this extra stuff for whatever reason, and it's like, what do you do about that, right? It's like, okay, well, we have to think about something. We have to think about like how we're going to make this happen exactly, and it's just, it gets to the point where it's like absolutely ridiculous to try to hold on to one idea even if it doesn't work, right? And so like, one of the results for the convolescence case specifically is like, yeah, let's pull back and make it so that it doesn't deal friendly splash. But then, there's the temptation to give it a special rule so it just doesn't do that to brood spawn. And then, because even if you pull back on the friendly splash in ZVZ, if you have convolescents attacking each other, then they're still going to splash the brood spawn anyway. So you're still going to get the same autism. So, like maybe we can kind of protect against that by increasing the damage it deals so that it kills the brood spawn a bit more frequently or whatever. But either way, like there's a couple of different things you can go about that. But you realize like, oh, there's this critical flaw with this idea. It needs to be, retooled in some way, or the execution needs to be adjusted or whatever. And that's where the rubber meets the road. But so many people give up when they meet any sort of friction. Like, oh, my idea didn't work immediately, I guess I'll just quit all development. That happens a fair bit, I feel like, from the people I've talked to.
Yeah, custom content's always been a very volatile thing to watch. I've often felt that I'm the only person in any given community who's remotely grounded in a sense that like there's a sense of stability for what I want done, how to get to it, a sense of standards, and not just experience, but also like a forward momentum, a forward thinking motion that's like, once this is done to whatever end, I'm going to probably work on something else. And, you know, a real vision. And again, I know I mentioned this before. It constantly brings me back where someone posted an image on your server a while ago that basically was said that most people can't envision things in their head. It was like an apple or something.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I still find that to this day unbelievable that people are actually incapable of doing that. But someone was just telling me a couple weeks ago about a VTuber that says she's like, oh, I have no internal monologue. I feel at peace waiting in line because I can just turn my brain off. I'm like, how the fuck do you even, how can you do that? Like, the more I think about it, the more I think that there just is, especially in the younger generations, but definitely starting with millennials, is a complete lack of thinking, like just thinking of any kind. And, you know, when somebody tries to present the insane belief that like games are art or whatever, that's absolutely where you reach the realization that people just don't actually think. So they don't even know what art even is. And they try to make these arguments because it gives them some substance. It gives them some kind of posture. It makes them feel like they're doing something with their lives when they're really just someone making shitty maps for a shitty game. That's kind of the other issue with custom content development and everything related in general is people elevate it to some mystical status that they're, oh my God, I'm making games. Isn't that so cool? When it's just any other thing you could be doing. You could be jacking off. You could be sewing a sweater. You could be mowing the lawn. There's no difference between that and making a game at all. Only the results actually matter. And ideas are only as valuable as the end results. If you have no end results, then an idea means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, it hasn't been actualized, right? It hasn't been turned into anything. So
yeah.
You can only like the main goal for me for when I'm trying to execute on an idea is to allow other people to interface with it, even if it's a private thing and never gets released to anybody else. Like the point is, if I sat somebody down and booted this up and let them play through it or experience it in whatever way, if it's like a video or something, it's like, what is the result? Like, are they able to interface with the ideas? Can they get the ideas? Like that's the thing that gets me when people say like, oh, there's no such thing as like objective quality. It's like, well, how about objectively, how efficient are you at communicating your idea through your execution? Like, how about we ask that question? Because that's a starter. Then you can say, that's why I always say like, well, if Blizzard's goal with Warcraft 3 was to make an RTS, they objectively failed because it's not, it doesn't work as an RTS model. So like clearly there's a way you can evaluate things in an objective sense. Nobody would ever agree that like basically you have to have different definitions of what an RTS means in order to make Warcraft 3 fit that category and like for it to feel like you're not just doing some shitty underhanded debate tactic of like, well, what actually is an RTS? Well, if we agree with our definitions, we lay out our definitions and we lay out our motivations that we imagine, like what the ideas were intended to be, then like how about that execution, buddy? Like how's that worked out for you? And obviously in the Blizzard case, it didn't work out well at all. But the point is like we can evaluate this stuff. We don't need to hide behind like, oh, it's art, so therefore you can't criticize it, which a lot of people do. And that does feel like, you know, I've noticed that in general, in keeping with the whole idea of like you'll be happy with less than you got before, like that the whole marketing angle that's sort of conditioned people in that direction. It probably does condition them to think less. I mean, just in general, because if you're not thinking super, like you when you were describing the person who can just turn their brain off and doesn't ever think about anything in line or whatever, and like the machine doesn't stop running for me. Like it just keeps going, and I have to wonder. Like I don't like ever entering into a philosophical space where I'm evaluating people and finding them like I'm clearly more elevated and smarter than these people or whatever. But like, and this is a big but, obviously, big but.
I'm Canadian, so I never have to worry about that. I'm well aware of my status of being a lower life form.
Yeah, it's more like for people who literally aren't thinking, like I guess maybe there's some advantages to that I'm not thinking of, but I just like really you don't have any ideas though, like really your best bet for this game was a copy paste of somebody else's idea and
it's just
poorly
dishonesty.
Done. Like yeah,
like,
I don't know.
That's what I do when I have my objective analysis process is I attempt to gauge the honesty of a product, because honesty is what ultimately allows genuine things to manifest. Honesty is what drives the actual quality of development. You can look at a product and it can be a real heaping pile of shit, and you can still see honesty in it. Because honesty is going to manifest. Honesty is going to manifest to quality of execution. If people put in an honest effort, it's going to show. Like, I think in many cases with Armies of Exego, there was an honest effort. But there was so many things holding that back. And you can see all the things holding it back. Just like within Brood War, I think there was things that were an honest effort. And that stops the moment you enter the single-player spectrum for that product. And
they had
with
some
Warcraft 3,
interesting
there was
voice
no
acting
honesty
and
at all.
voice edits, but otherwise, yeah, it was just like a total wash. I mean, none of the mission designs were compelling at all.
And that's the difference between them and Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2. Yeah. Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2 are thoroughly dishonest projects. They're not people trying to make games. They're people trying to sell a grift, basically.
I mean, on the one hand, you can even maybe make that evaluation of Brood War in many ways, like it's a copy
you can,
and paste
for the campaign in particular.
Yeah, but to think about like it initially was supposed to be this middle market entry that just like padded their resume of games that they've released as a company. Like
they
if
wanted
you go
a
into the
Warhammer
history
game,
of it,
so they made Warhammer.
Yeah, and they didn't get the licensing and all this other shit, and then. By the way, I just like the fact that, Games Workshop was like, well, we're not allowing you to make a game. And then, first of all, flash forward now, motherfucker. Like, you guys are allowing anybody and their mother to have access to the IP. Yep. But second of all, the fact that StarCraft did end up being such an insane success. I mean, it probably wouldn't have been as successful if it was a Warhammer game, let's be real. Like, for whatever reason, like, the fact is, because Blizzard didn't get their way, they were forced to do a modicum of effort. And also because they were shown up by that totally fraudulent trailer at E3 or whatever it was for Dominion 3. It's like...
Same for, when they had the Warcraft in space thing. Like their initial iterations, they had to do better. Yeah. They were compelled to make an improvement, and they did. And now that doesn't happen, and look at the end result.
Yeah, I mean, if only they were criticized for Warcrafting in space, like all the other times that they did it, right? Like... everything else being so derivative, like the fact that they don't even work on their own products anymore. Like they haven't released a game since. Well, you can be really rude and say that ever, but like they haven't released a game. Like the last time they released a game was Overwatch. Like that was their latest. Yeah, that was their latest IP that they delivered a new title for. Like, everything since then has been either an expansion pack or, like, Overwatch 2, but it's literally the same game, so XD. And then I guess that's it, because all of their remasters were done by other people. And even then, they would be remasters and not new games. So, like, they actually have not released... Like, their Diablo 4, I guess, is going to be the next actual game that they release, but... because that is recently hit beta or whatever. But I don't know anything.
It's
about
apparently
that.
A disaster.
Yeah, I only know.
Surprise!
Yeah, I've read a few articles, people talking about the skill progression or whatever. I still remember because I played a bit of Diablo 2 before Diablo 3 was announced, and then when I saw that Diablo 3, I think I saw something how they only had like 4 classes or something like that on launch. Like they had, or maybe it was 3 classes. It was like a really small number when it was like Barbarian, Witch, and like one other thing.
And their skill sets were just completely gutted,
Yeah, I didn't know many of the details. I just remember seeing that they only had a few classes, and I was like, well, isn't that just an obvious downgrade from Diablo 2 that had way more? Like, like that was my first, and this is when I'm like, kind of, like, I'm like a teenager at this time or whatever. I'm not thinking super critically. But I remember the first thing that as soon as I found out that they didn't have all of the returning classes or any new ones from the previous game, I was like, well, that's just worse, though. And, like, I remember you had a similar feeling going from shooters when you were going through, like, Time Splitters and Perfect Dark and stuff. And then, like, obviously all these shooters remove bots and, like, scale back features and stuff. And it's like, well, that's just worse, though. Like, you're just worse. So what's the deal? It's just
worse. Like, why would I engage a product that is objectively inferior?
Yeah. I mean, it would have to have some really, like, it would have to over-deliver on something else, because you're literally removing features from the list. Like, you at least have to be really good in the areas that you do decide to include relative to the past games in the franchise or in the genre, and they often aren't. They often don't satisfy that condition, so it just is really wacky. I feel like RTS is not the only genre that has been absolutely upended years and years ago now, but... like shooters definitely fall into that category a lot, but I feel like it's just there's not really
the stage shooters is so sad.
Yeah,
Everybody is just chasing either Battle Royale or Call of Duty, and there's just no shooters. They're just all shits. And none of them even try to have feature parity with N64 titles. Like, come on, guys. Do something. You know, the image you like poking something with a stick. Do something. Like, do something. The FPS genre just hasn't seen anything even remotely attractive conceptually as an idea for so fucking long.
I remember the original.
Feels like the last time you could get excited for shooters was the PlayStation 2.
Well, that might be true. I haven't followed the genre super closely, but I know people were really excited when Titanfall came out because it was like the first shooter. Well, it has robots, but it also was like the first shooter to actually give you mobility in a while.
Yeah, and then they turned it into Call of Duty instead.
Yeah. I was gonna. It
came out. They gutted the Titans. The whole thing crashed. Surprise, surprise.
Well, then they made Apex Legends, which is Battle Royale, and then on top of doing that, they basically neglected the games while one salty hacker just shut down the servers for both Titanfall and Titanfall 2. So
yeah, I remember hearing about that.
It's like, how do you fuck
Blizzard and their offshoots and their copycats and all these trickle down effects? Just really funny because you had Firefall 2, which was ex-Blizzard. That was going to use the Project Offset engine way back, and then it disappeared forever, and then it came back, and then it immediately collapsed. I'm not sure. Did it? Yeah, it did get released. Oh, yeah, that's right. HKS gave me videos of that. It was some of the buggiest shit imaginable. Surprise, surprise. All of Blizzard's offshoots make the most buggiest shit that you can fucking see. You had Hellgate London deleting people's items, and amongst 1,000 other things I have recordings of from way back when the Chinese relaunch came out. And then he had Firefall, which I believe HKS sent me videos. I went looking for them. I could find them. But he was like stuck under the ground and everything like that. Like just really basic bitch shit. The action RPG as well. A very, very, very dead genre. Hasn't seen anything interesting released for like 20 years and probably never will ever again. And Kian apparently recently experienced the God of War game that you rage quit like an hour or something into, and
he released a 12-hour fucking video recently.
He's got to be a glutton for punishment, that man.
Honestly,
if it isn't Vassals, it's ARPGs.
Yeah, I played or I watched a decent amount of the previous 2 episodes of his playthrough, and it was just he was like talking to some ghost that didn't have any animations for talking, so it just like nodded his head or whatever, instead of lip syncing or anything. I just remember seeing that, and it was like the laziest particles you could think of course. And it's like,
no.
Like that's just the first thing I see when I see it. But it's not like there's any actual gameplay, so I don't know.
No.
Man. It's
they
stupid.
had to throw in talent trees, and I haven't seen it too much. I've seen a little bit of it. It looked like a really shitty over the shoulder shooter from what I saw, because it was a guy circling around a small cylindrical room with 2 or 3 enemies chasing him with an axe. And he would just like throw the axe at them, otherwise just slowly backpedal. And the enemies may have had like a line trace or something they very slowly wound up to, and it was just so dreadfully fucking bad. I do not understand how God of War ever became financially successful at all. That game should have tanked within the first release, and that should have been it. Because it is literally just a shitty clone of DMC that introduces QuickTime events. The fact there wasn't enough pushback against QuickTime events that got all these shitty games shut down really tells you all you need to know about this industry and that genre in particular, because it just got worse and worse and worse and worse until you hit like Nier Automata, where literally the entire fucking game is a carnival game of mini games instead of an actual ARPG. And what ARPG elements there are in there are some of the most unimaginatively bland shit. Like I said, I've got like a 7.5 hour New Game Plus run to cast over one of these days. A Swedishman sent me. And he sent me clips of it before, and I did do short cast overs at the time, which is what led to him making this long recording. And like he encounters a big end game boss, and it's really high level. And what it does is it just sits there and starts spinning. And it's like every fucking one of these games has to have, and people pointed this out to me from many cases, they got to have the sumo pose, the wrestling pose. They've got to have pound the ground, make a shockwave, and then they got to spin. And it's just so creatively bankrupt across the entire thing. And like that's the entire genre. It's just like I think all game genres are really in a terrible state and have been for a long time because they're all so intermeshed with each other. But particularly the genres that see people shoehorning in crap from other genres or whatever. Like when Nier Automata starts with you running through a really shitty shmup into a whole bunch of other crap instead of just like throwing you into an ARPG, and it's supposed to be an ARPG, you know immediately you're in a bad state. But you know, Platinum Games hasn't done anything good in their entire record, period. So it's, you know, you go from like Bayonetta, where their idea of engaging gameplay was QTEs and then inverting your fucking camera, amongst other things, and then more mini games, and like they don't know what to do. So we gotta throw in stuff. We gotta make you mash the buttons because arcades did that. Well, arcades also had buttons that were like 3 or 4 times the size of a controller button or a keyboard key.
Yeah.
And mashing it wasn't ever particularly engaging to begin with. I don't know why you would ever think to bring it in. But you bring it in onto a platform where it is actually straining on your fingers to be doing this. And cracking open a bear.
Fuck yeah.
And, you know, it's just like, you know that when you're grasping for straws to just yank and pull in stuff from anywhere else to bring into your game instead of just making your game what it is.
Yeah.
You know, heroes and RTSs, for example, and items and leveling. You never actually really had any interest in the genre to begin with. You feel forced to work into it.
I think
and
there's room in theory for some of these legacy mechanics that are totally fucked, like heroes and shit. You could make a game that is about the combination. That's sort of what Warcraft 3 would like everybody to think it is, but it's just like, oh, we can't.
It's a lot of work.
We can't make this game performance, so let's just shrink all the combat and make it take ages and stuff. You know what I mean? Like,
you got to go from the start, and you got to have a real strong goal.
Oh yeah,
and you really got to work hard on it because, you know, that's going to be what defines the game, as opposed to something you shoehorned in just because we don't know what we're doing. And again, that brings us into the whole dishonesty thing, is you know when people do stuff because it was something they really intended to do, and then it was something they did out of convenience. And with Warcraft 3, it was just all convenience. We can be as lazy as possible. And I'm sure that's why it's 3D on top of 3D being the in thing. We had to be 3D because everybody else is 3D and 3D is modern. That was the whole problem with the N64 and everything related. But it's also because it's so much easier to slap together the shittiest of 3D graphics than it is to try to figure out a sprite rendering pipeline that would look any good. And the net result was Warcraft 3, where it's just this bulbous, blobby mess.
Yeah,
and you can just masquerade as like, well, every other 3D game at the point is a bulbous, blobby mess. And then you have the bigger problem where every game 20 years later is also a bulbous, blobby mess. And he's still an unreadable heaping pile of shit. Yeah. Like even the most fucking janked ass 2D RTS that you or Fagmon find from buried away in the bowels of the internet, some of them are absolutely retina bleeding, and they're still more readable than StarCraft 2 is.
Big fan. So I actually didn't know anything about Firefall, but you name dropped it earlier. And I just want to read this off. I don't know if you know much about it, so you might be able to corroborate this, but I thought it was an interesting anecdote anyway. Somebody was, there's a discussion about times where developers listening to the community turned out poorly. And somebody comments, the biggest example is Firefall. The CEO would get drunk and go on forums and take suggestions and then rewrite the entire game based on them. One time, someone said PvP sucks, you should just remove it. And he fucking did. He literally went and disabled PvP that night and never turned it back on.
I mean, they're ex-Blizzard, so yeah, that's likely the way Blizzard did, now that they weren't restricted from actually interacting with the general public.
Yeah. Well,
because it's really obvious that Blizzard has a policy that you're not allowed to interact with anybody. Like, human interaction is completely off limits. Discord only.
Well, that explains a lot. Well, there's that Mark Kern guy who I just remember from retweeting softcore porn on Twitter a lot. For whatever reason, I had to unfollow him. So,
well, there's that really creepy guy that posts about Sylvanas.
Oh, yeah. I remember. It's like one guy who's like, it's Sylvanas' turn to lead or something. I don't know, he cringed to me.
He has a whole timeline of just like cringe maxed. I think he might be a troll, but people at Blizzard have demonstrably proven time and time again, they're all completely fucking unhinged, detached from reality, and substance abusers. So, maybe it is real, and that's what's more terrifying than anything.
The fact that we can't immediately discount it, is all the proof you need that this place is fucked up, man.
This is the face of the guy probably stealing your breast milk. That's how he subsists.
Yeah, needs
and
that.
And then
protein.
he role plays with it.
Yeah, of course.
Brotein.
I think. You know what? We were talking about Warcraft 3 earlier. One of the biggest problems with that game is obviously that its time to kill is too high, but CMBW's time to kill was too low. So you want to talk about that for a bit, because that's this is supposed to be the original topic, but
supposed to be.
We need
then you
more
get
time.
Rambling, and then you get drinking, and then you get cracking open the bears, and then I have to run AOK like 50 times in a row, and then who knows where the fuck you end up.
Now we're back.
Inside the arms of another man.
Yeah, go ahead. What were you thinking? You have some immediate thought?
I was just gonna drag us into it. Time to kill. So I never really thought of things as time to kill. It's just, to me, that's kind of like a new word terminology that's kind of come up. But
yeah, it's like how long
I just
think
think of it as like
to resolve,
pacing.
how much time you have to react to a threat that appears without you knowing, or even like, you A-moved somewhere that you didn't know enemy units were, just to like get your army on the map, and then they start fighting, and like if it happens too quickly, then you literally can't interact with the game as a human. I mean, you really, really high level players can, but that's what we see in StarCraft 2, for example, is that you can walk your units into death without really even having a chance to correct the mistake. Yep. Like, it can be too late very quickly. Like, as soon as you start interacting with another unit, the battle.
And conversely, in Warcraft 3, you have time to make lunch.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, I think there's a happy medium to be found. I think, I was thinking about this in general, that one of the reasons why Brood War itself at the professional level is doesn't have that much volatility is nothing to do with the units. It's actually to do with the fact that pros have like solved out a lot of the opening moves, because you actually are super vulnerable. Like, if two Zerglings get in your base as a Terran or a Protoss, or probably, well, especially as a Zerg, like ZVZ is so stupid in default StarCraft. But like, if two Zerglings get into somebody's base, that can actually be game over. Yep. Because they can really butcher enemy units and really start harassing stuff. And they also delay.
That brings me back to July Zerg and those drone drills.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that the games ended super early because he exploited the very thing you're talking about, where it is possible to do some really non-standard stuff. Yeah. But again, just like you're saying, there are sort of accepted standards in the ways that people are doing things, and people just kind of expect that, or they might play around that, and you can completely throw that over, upend it. Yeah,
and one of the goals, or one of the things that we've noticed in general since the removal of supply, and since just this past, I mean, we made this observation. I made the observation in one of the past episodes that we scale damage, but we don't really scale durability as much. So your offensive power grows higher than your defensive power generally, or your survivability generally, as an individual set of units. And while I think some units will always have pretty good offensive power, like you think about the Akantor, obviously it deals like 80 damage a pop or whatever, or maybe it's 60 now. And anyway, it's pretty powerful, and it's something that you will definitely that's a concentrated amount of damage, but that can be like its identity as a unit, and that's why it's slow, and it needs the transports and stuff, and it's got this identity we're borrowing in some ways from the default set of StarCraft, but it's obviously very different now because it doesn't require pathing, and you can dodge them and all this other stuff. I actually think, even though it can go over terrain now, the Akantor's attack, compared to the Reaver in StarCraft 1. It's still more fair, I feel like, because of the fact that it's so slow you can adapt to it. But it can definitely catch you off guard, and it does make certain areas of the map. It benefits from range, from cliff advantage now, and it's
this kills the Shambler.
Yeah, he just heard me say that Akantors are fair, and he started fuming immediately and deleting them from his campaign or something. So, but I think it's interesting anyway that, some units will still have that offensive power as a call sign, as a signal of what their real identity is. But if we baseline raise the durability, then you have a little bit more breathing room for actual decisions to be made. And it doesn't make the game take ages, although there are still some cases where maybe the new Atreus that shoots fast but deals insignificant damage for one hit is now more about like sustained combat or whatever. It's not very good at destroying like buildings and stuff, and that's just because buildings still have a pretty decent amount of health. I didn't raise anything with buildings, but like there's a lot of cases where maybe durability will still be a problem, and we're still balancing out tier 3 and stuff, and there's a couple of things we still have to do revision wise, like vulture mine laying and reclamation and whatnot. But I think broadly speaking, the goal was time to kill is too low, like battles resolve too fast basically. Defender's advantage gets neutralized by the advantage you get of tempo when you start a fight, because battles can end super quickly if you're out of position. So it's much more punishing to be on the receiving end of early aggression or any aggression. And you made this observation about the mid game that like as the offensive power scales, you actually get less time to react, even less time to react when like you have tier 2 air fighting each other or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's like, you know, somebody can start the fight and end it in the same sort of 5-second period, where that can be like thousands and thousands of resources and, you know, many, many minutes of like massing up your army and stuff. And
then an apostle comes by and revives it all.
Yeah. And so you can see how that would be really insane. Like that would be bad for the game flow, because the whole point is that like once you reach, like paradoxically, you're supposed to have more durability and more like staying power when you're higher tier, but it was not happening that way. It was actually the opposite, where the game, in some ways, the game became a bit more volatile when you unlocked certain really high power tools, because the time to actually resolve the battles, the battle time was just really, really low as a result of that. So I think flipping that, where durability is now scaling higher, faster than offensive power, and that like some of the baseline durability is a bit higher and the baseline offensive power is a bit lower. I did that stat crunch I was talking about, where I reset it so that 0 armor pen and 0 armor are more normal. That's like the baseline, instead of it being 1 for each. And as a result, it's allowed me to make the numbers a bit more sane and easy to comprehend. Like, as a general rule at tier 1, if you have 2 armor pen, then your role as a unit is going to be for like dealing with armored units, because 2 armor now is a lot, whereas before it was just like, oh, most units feel like they have it at tier 2, and a lot of units have it at tier 1, and some units even have more than that. Like now the Goliath and Drakodin have 2, before they had 3, and the Zoristolith had 4, and now 3. It has, I think now it has 2 as well. So it's like there's just all of these changes that we made with the express purpose of making it so that the stats are more understandable immediately, and that units have more defined roles as either like, you know, offensive units that are good versus lightly armored units, and offensive units that are good versus heavily armored units, or whatever. And then, you know, we stress the whole like mobility versus survivability versus offensive power, like trifecta, because 3. So maybe that gives you some ideas for more things to talk about as how this reflects with your understanding of the game. Like you were talking about how time to kill maybe isn't the term you would use, but like the pacing of battles, it does feel like we're going to be in a better spot now that we've made this change. Do you think that we made correct observations based on how I broke it down about how the battles were sort of playing out?
I just read this thing from Fagudo. Let me vocalize it for you. Control groups will be reset during cutscenes. These will have to be manually re-added post in-game cutscene. If the player manages to skip a cutscene using unintended debug functionality, this may cause unintended mission behavior or crashes.
Absolutely incredible.
No context. Just read that out in your head or listen to my voice and just picture, if you will, a game developer wants unskippable cutscenes but has unintended debug functionality still in the game. For some reason, skipping the cutscenes breaks their entire map. They don't have a way to lock out player control with a single variable. Wouldn't be me. Wouldn't be me. Anyways, it's time to kill. So, I viewed it as pacing because I looked at the time to kill as being something that would reflect the actual time to build and then the general pacing of the macro gameplay, at least with how units would interact with buildings. But when we looked at CMBW, I did just hand you that video about a couple of days ago of some very, very fast matches, which more properly reflect the average match between us, or the average match between me and Shambler, where I am usually leaving the game in 4 or 5 minutes, because 1 unit or 2 units dies, and then that's the end of the game. That doesn't even begin to accurately reflect what happens later in the game, which you can see kind of with the key in game, where you would have didacts and then some defenses kind of bouncing aggro around because they're really hard to deal with, but then that takes a lot longer to actually kill stuff. But then you would also have cases where you have a bunch of Valkyries that would come up to something and just instantly erase it. So there was just like, to me, the kind of the problem in the game was not just that time to kill may have been too low, it was also really inconsistent. So a fight between a bunch of Atreuses and then a bunch of Phalanxes and Goliaths or whatever could be quite short. But the second you started getting into... Oh, now I'm being interrupted. When you get into... Obviously, the stacking is an issue with this. But, I mean, let's look at Vultures, for example. A game will end effectively just with one Spider Mine. Because if you can just get a Spider Mine near the workers, it'll just blow up and instantly kill like 10 workers. And that can happen within like 3 minutes into the game. There's a few reasons why this ends up happening. It's just, I mean, that's the way StarCraft is in general. But you can't get mines to pop on workers. So that's kind of like a shoehorned in way of trying to balance something that obviously is really rough around the edges no matter which way you look at it. And when you look at it like that, you realize that StarCraft normally has a bunch of boilerplates in it that stop this kind of thing from kind of influencing the game that now it does, because you've standardized a lot of stuff. And standardizing things exposes a lot of issues. But it's also that AoE is more abundant within CMBW in general, that it makes the stacking behavior so much worse. Normally in Brood War, like say for example TVZ, you're quite able to just stack your Melisks together and dance them around all the way up until the point you start seeing science vessels. That's because science vessels are just so overwhelmingly stupid, because they apply something that's going to basically kill whatever it is they put it on, except for like an Ultralisk. And it also does perpetual AoE damage. So now it just literally just immediately shuts down this entire thing just because of the way it functions. So then it becomes less about the power budget of something and more about the utility and how that utility is expressed. Now, utility is one of those things that's nebulous because of, it's just by name, the way you call it utility is because of the way it expressed. It's not really finite. It's not like I do 6 damage, you do 5 damage. It's more like I do 6 damage plus I have CC. And now the CC is now going to be expressed in a way which is really hard to measure out how it's going to actually be expressed in the game. Now, generally, stunning is the most powerful thing you can do. Anything that results in loss of control shuts down a huge chunk of a power budget. So it's always going to be more powerful than just raw numbers. So even something that does only, like, say, 2 damage, but has some kind of crowd control element is going to be more powerful than something that does straight up 6 damage, because the crowd control prevents you from ever doing any damage at all. Or it restricts or controls your ability to deal damage, so on and so forth. And AoE is very similar because, well, stacking, but even without stacking, the Spider Mine exploding and dealing 100 damage all across the board is going to be infinitely more powerful than, let's say, for example, 1 or 2 shots from a Silver Tongue that only does like 50 damage to 1 unit. So just because you spread that out, that, 100 and 125 damage is going to overkill a lot of shit. So putting all that damage into one spot doesn't even necessarily do you too much good depending on what your target is. But if you hit a whole bunch of units for it, then something that's way more powerful. Also the fact that even if it doesn't kill them, it gets them low. And then therefore the burst damage of units that maybe don't do that much burst damage, or the burst damage of units that now are capable of one-shotting them, that's something, the utility is now much higher for those. So the way that all these numbers interact gets into the point where you have to think about how the interactions are playing out. So that's why I looked at it largely from a pacing perspective, is I almost never looked at unit-to-unit interactions except in really specific cases, usually with like cross-tier equivalents, basically, is how effective is this unit versus how effective is that unit. And I looked a lot less at the numbers and the time to kill and more about their individual performance and how they stand out during multi-unit engagements. And I would find, that simple units should have more of a noise effect where they contribute, but they don't take like your absolute focus. Whereas the higher tier the units, the more focus, and then therefore the more utility they should have. So that's why kind of like when Apex expanded up in the tiers, you did start seeing units that would have more health, more armor, more weapons. But as I said last time we talked about this, the way that they expressed their power budget really came out to like more utility, more weapons, more ability to target individual units, longer range, and then you start seeing some splash and stuff like that. Whereas, as we talked about when we were doing the armor penetration discussion with CMBW, a lot of power utility started coming up into raw numbers of damage. In particular, damage started getting quite high. Armor penetration generally wasn't something you cared as much about or even really paid attention to at the high levels. When you start thinking about things like penumbras and stuff like that, it's more like this unit does high damage, has AoE, maybe does friendly fire. Those are really the major things you start thinking about with those kinds of units versus the actual armor penetration system. And obviously when you start having air units stacking and stuff on top of it, it gets to be really stupid because now in one of the matches I had a whole bunch of those I guess you never saw them or casted them. I had all those matches against Shambler, and one of the matches that I lost was a PVT, and that was where he went actually for tier 2.5 air pretty quickly.
Okay.
So he went like mass salamanders. And I countered that with a combination of Storms and Atriuses because the Salamanders would stack up and then suddenly Atriuses became relevant against this otherwise very difficult to fight force because it was one of his maps that had kind of like air only, drop only sunken expansions all around the middle and a whole bunch of winding paths that were kind of annoying to navigate around with land units. But because Atriuses did splash damage, that really didn't matter. I just used them to zone out his Salamanders. Of course, I couldn't actually penetrate his base because it was full of Sentinels and Salamanders. But I could stop him from really doing anything with his air units, and I was just killing them. Then it reached the point that he managed to get to tier 3, and he didn't go Ion Cannons, he went Hippogriffs.
Right.
And this, I believe, was post-penetration changes. I actually was not aware that Hippogriffs did splash damage. They do splash damage to the form of their line trace.
Yes,
I had always been under the impression that they did single target damage, and it was just an issue with their graphic that looked like they should be penetrating, but it never seemed like they actually did penetrating.
There were so many bugs with that. It just now it works basically.
Yeah. So I didn't realize that until I started losing the entire map to Hippogriffs. And of course, as Protoss, you don't really have a way you can get on top of Hippogriffs, especially when the map's kind of difficult to navigate with land units.
Yeah.
What land units can you bring against a force that has a whole ton of Hippogriffs and then Olympians? There's not really a lot that's going to actually get close enough to threaten the Hippogriffs, and when you do get close, they're just going to cut you anyways. Your air units are either not durable or fast enough. So my idea was, okay, I figured they were still single target. I wasn't realizing really what was going on. I was like, I'm just going to spam the fuck out of Vassals. The Vassals will take the early shots, and then my units, being Star Sovereigns, Empyreans, and Carriers, are going to get close enough to them to actually deal damage to them. And then I realized that they just wiped out every single, 100, 200 Vassals, in half a second, and all my other air units instantly died.
Yeah.
And I realized, wait, they're dealing splash damage. And this was all based on the experiences I had using Hippogriffs myself in the past, where it was quite possible for Protoss to fight Hippogriffs using heavy air and Didax just by bull rushing them because their line trace wasn't actually really working. So they might kill heavier Star Sovereigns, but if you had a comparable number of units, you could still get up to them, and it's not like they have a huge amount of health. Right. You can just burst them down and kill them. Very different when they actually deal proper line trace damage. Very different. And just that one little change just completely changed the power balance of the unit completely. And it reached a point where everything that I had melted just immediately before they ever even got close to him. And at that time, I had most of the map, and I lost over half of what I had due to stacks of Hippogriffs and Olympians and stuff like that. And there wasn't anything I could really do because of Valkyries as well. Valkyries are definitely kind of an issue because their splash radius is high. They're very, very tanky, especially for air units, which usually aren't boasting 4 armor on top of a whole bunch of health for only 50 gas.
Yep.
They're very cost efficient for the amount of stats you get out of them. And in order to counter them with Protoss, you basically need to have splash. You have to have Empyreans. But at the best I found with Empyreans is that you might get one volley off and then you're going to die. You have to really carefully spread them out. You have to do what I did against Kian, which is separate like 3 or 4 different groups of air units, but of course he didn't have that many Valkyries to begin with, so I was able
He
to
only had a
overpower
few,
him.
from what I saw.
But against Shambler, he had a whole lot of them. So everything I had, even when I managed to split his damage, the amount of damage that he put out, because of the fact they also, I believe, had 4 armor penetration, was a lot. When you think about it, only 3 or 4 Valkyrie shots is going to be like 60, 80 damage in a spot. And it's not like Empyreans are tanky enough to actually take that even if they're not being splashed. Whereas the Empyrean's attack rate is not as responsive, it's slower, and since they fire in several shots that over a period of time versus the Valkyrie which fires one shot, the Valkyries do actually have time to spread out and mitigate some of the damage. So there's utility expression in just the way that they attack. So the Valkyries are extremely efficient for what they do. Solarian interceptors were not capable of blocking them when there were so many of them. So you weren't really able to stop them from hitting you either, but you had to go into them in a stack to get up to the hippogriffs. Your units are going to stack when you're trying to get into one spot to attack something.
Yeah.
So that the hippogriffs move back and the Valkyries move forward, you're in a state where if you try to start spreading your units, now you're moving slower because you're moving in non-direct angles. You're never going to catch up to the hippogriffs, just going to turn around and shoot you anyways. So it just was an absolutely unwinnable circumstance. And that ultimately just has to do with how those numbers are being expressed versus than just the numbers themselves. If it's just the numbers themselves, the Star Sovereigns will wipe the floor with everything every single time because they deal the highest burst damage. They can attack while moving, and they have the highest defensive stats. But then when you see how the battles actually play out, it will end very fast and it will not end in your favor. And of course, that's the problem with ion cannons too, is that they did so much upfront damage right away. So they would deal like 200 immediate damage, which would not, even if it didn't kill everything that it hit immediately, it would usually go through most of the shields. And then the second couple of shots would deal a huge chunk of health damage. So even if you escaped the initial barrage, you were still low enough on health, and Protoss didn't have a way to repair their units, that if you try to move in again, all your units are just going to die anyways. It's kind of like the simulacrum thing, where you may pop the simulacrum and cause it to respawn, but now both simulacrums have like 1 or 2 actual health, and it just doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
Right? And most are going to take a hit from something for you. But again, with the way that CMBW is, because the rate of attacking is higher, splash damage is in greater abundance, range is more easily accessible depending on certain races, and units are more responsive. All of those all lead into the time to kill being lower, even if the actual numbers aren't really that high. Like when you look at quasis and stuff like that, it's not like their damage values are high. It's not like they're going to be machine gunning down shit. But when you look at the actual fights of like a Zerg versus Zerg, the fights end mega fast. Things just fucking melt all over the place because their attack rates are really high. That's one of the reasons why Zethicors just chow through buildings, is armor penetration plus attack rate. Their damage values is not very high. And Vassals, again, the same way. They're just tickling things to death, but you can stack them. And you can get a fuck ton of them very quickly. So the efficiency of the way that things attack is much more efficient. And in Brood War, you had to get adrenaline glands later on. By the time you got adrenaline glands, you were already looking in tier 3 or whatever the equivalent was. So it was less relevant, and they didn't have armor penetration. So units like, Ultralisks or whatever would still be able to tank them anyways. So, we had that discussion, and I haven't really seen too much as a result of that. When I played versus Kian, only some parts of tier 2 were changed. In fact, I believe Valkyries may have received some. I think they did 14 damage. That's something as opposed to 20 at that point.
Yeah.
Tier 1, it didn't really feel too much different for me, but we didn't really have a lot of tier 1. I did see Zerg versus Zerg with tier 1. Oh, yeah, we played a couple of those team games.
Yeah.
Obviously, I came from where my gut instinct with Zerg Mineral Dump was to build a Zeracors, because they could deal AoE damage, they were good at fighting infantry, and they were tanky enough to actually get close to things. And I built like 8 or 10 Zeracors against Veek's Quasis, and he just killed all of them immediately. And then I also built them against Terran, and they melted to bunkers so fast. And Cyprians felt extremely oppressive in bunkers.
Yeah.
They were really, really hard to deal with at tier 1, and even in tier 2. Because we did have that tier 2 with Shambler, which unfortunately you didn't get to see. But it was me and Shambler versus was it Keen and Beaver?
Oh yeah, but was this the game I got dropped in or something? I think maybe that's.
Hold on here. I'm trying to figure out. I would like to mute vents so I'm not hearing people talking, but Windows is such a great piece of software that I don't actually see the vent window.
Classic.
He's talking that there could be a Bubsy 3D remastered, and I can't.
You can't.
I'm
handle
not
that
capable.
Right now.
How do I get it to? See, Windows has this problem where like Explorer will break, and then you have to kill Explorer.
Yeah.
And I would just like for Windows to not hide when that happens. Like it's hidden, right? I'm just going to close it and relaunch it in that case. So oh yeah, this 2v2. So the 2v2, it was there was a proxy. I think it may have been his worker that there was two workers there, so I'm not sure if they like both hit a worker. It was in that one map where you start next to each other, top versus bottom. It was the Shakura's tile set.
Yeah, that's Parabola. That's my map.
Yeah. So there was the 4 gas area, and he was able to get like 4 or 5 or 6 bunkers full of Cyprians up there. And there was nothing we had that could do anything against them. Shambler was Zerg, and I was Protoss, and I actually went Positrons. And Positrons had about range to attack them, but the Cyprians could do so much more damage to them that there was nothing I could do against, and they couldn't hit the SCV behind them.
Yeah, that's right. So that was when that was before I had updated every tier 2 thing, and after I think it was after that game I had revised the architect into an artillery unit, like a dedicated like longer range artillery unit, basically.
I actually went for architects because I was like, okay, like at this point we had lost both of our main bases.
Yeah.
So we started building on the size of the map, and so this like comparatively low investment killed all my positrons, killed I don't know how much Shambler shit, but it was a lot. And then both of our main structures, a bunch of tech structures, a good chunk of workers, and I actually just built a crucible next to my gas so I could keep harvesting the gas because he couldn't reach the far geysers. But he was able to get a few bunkers into Shambler's base that I would ping him and he would kill them. But there was a lot of damage that came out of that because the tier 1 units just were not capable of fighting Cyprians at all. Especially with the ramps. You had to go up the ramps to get to them. And I went for architects and they couldn't even get vision up there.
Yeah.
So the architect didn't have the range to deal with that. I actually had to go right up to optectons, which then just immediately shut it down. And
yeah, because at that point nothing in tier 3 had been updated.
Yeah.
So there's like
two
different fucking stat paradigms being interacting with each other. This is really
then at that point I had 2 Templar archives, so I just went for archons and optectons and attacked them after that, and Shambler was attacking them. He basically just ignored the proxy at that point because it was just a waste of resources and started harassing them instead. And then one of them had tier 3 at that point when I got up there, and it was Penumbras versus Optectons, and Optectons just fucking killed everything. So that was more interesting interaction because both the Penumbras and the Optectons have really long cooldowns.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and they were both fat enough that the splash really wasn't a contributing factor. So actually you had a fairly small scale tier 3 fight that was actually really quite slow paced. And it was definitely really different than a lot of the other cases in the game where when these units usually attack anything, it's just a huge amount of damage right away. So don't really have any metric by which to base the current changes on because I haven't even seen the full results of the tier 1 changes, much less the other ones. But when I looked at AoE within my projects, I usually ended up using the spread attacks for AoE as opposed to an individual attack that does AoE as a base. Obviously, doing that today, I had to have a way to change the pattern for it because it was random, and random's not good. But what it did is it did separate the AoE a little bit. You're
talking about something similar to the Paladin's ability where it fires like in an offset or whatever. So it's like a predetermined pattern that you define somewhere. And then okay.
That was just so that you had the benefit of having area of effect damage.
Right.
But it wasn't always consistently overlapping all that damage into one spot. So you couldn't put so much damage into a small space all at once unless you had a whole ton of these units firing at once. That helped a little bit with the air stacking, and it helped a little bit with area of effect in general, where you wanted something that could deal damage in a wide radius, but not super reliably all in one spot, so that one spot would see like this disproportionate amount of damage compared to what single target units would be doing. And then, we had like in ITAS, a lot of units had that kind of AoE damage. But including units like the various Xenon Project battleships that had huge, long multi-attacks that all did spread attacks. But they were more effective against units with larger collision, where then you would hit them more often, versus smaller units where a lot of those shots would actually deal only... Each individual shot only had a small amount of radius to its damage. So you could actually end up doing not too much damage against a small unit, where some of the shots would sometimes not hit it or splash it. That's usually how I approach splash in a lot of that, because single large individual radius meant that you could just put so much area of effect damage. I mean, this is also an issue with stacking in general, but you would still run into it with ground units as well, because you didn't want every unit to be super fat, especially with the way the pathing is, because it's gross. But when you had units that were small, they just felt like unfairly disproportionate to getting hit with massive amounts of AoE damage, because it was so consistent. And like, say the Penumbra, for example, it's just one shot AoE. Or in this case, what the Iskander would be like, where its splash doesn't feel super massive, but you still get a fuck ton of mileage of it out against infantry. Like, again, in an Achaean game, I just went for a fast Iskander, and it just like immediately shut down his aggression because he was all infantry, and like one shot could kill like 4 or 5 units in a hit, which would be a lot more effective than if I had gone like even Atreus is at that point, because their damage and AoE is not as high. And just that one attack, that one hit that deals a huge amount of damage in one spot as an AoE is what leads to the time to kill being really short, because most units are just not going to have enough health to withstand 2 or 3 hits from this much, and at that tier, most units can't even take 1 hit from that. So,
well, what I was just thinking is a way to handle the Iskander a bit differently would probably... I mean, I was thinking in my head, like, while you're talking about it, if you can anticipate when it's actually going to explode instead of it not looking any different when it's... Because you don't know where it's going, right? Is the problem. So it can be targeted at, like, a unit that's really close or a unit that's far. One of the things I was thinking about just now is if we made it so that it detonated on the first target it came into contact with, like the same way that the Empyrean or Valkyrie missiles work, then now you can actually make a choice like, oh, it's slow moving enough, I can just intercept it with a Zephyr core or something, right? Or like I can walk a Maverick into it or whatever. And then suddenly there's like a bit more of an interesting positional dance you can do with that unit, which is, probably makes it a little bit more interesting without really affecting the unit's power budget too much. But in general, one of the things I did with heavy damage single target weapons, especially if they were splash or whatever, is I made it so that I increased the cooldown by at least a few frames. In general, like a lot of weapons got at least 2 frames of cooldown, which adds up quite a bit over time. It's kind of hard to like anticipate what that exact figure means, but it's going to be pretty effective. So that alone definitely helped, I think, with a lot of the units, and some units might be a little bit too weak now relative to what they're supposed to be. Like, people were saying that the Izira and maybe the Hydra are also a little bit too weak for compared to what they used to be, but also like what they're meant
it's also
to be.
In part because of the investment for the Hydrock is really high early on. Because especially with the mining changes, it takes so long to get the gas for that. That's a long time that your workers are not really contributing anything to the rest of your play. Like if you wanted to go for a fast expand, you really can't. And it takes so long to get the gas. And then by the time you do get the gas, Protoss can have Dracodins out, Terran can have Cyprians out. Like they can just actuate that gas way faster than you can.
Yeah, I think making it so that it's 25 less gas or whatever is probably fine, because at this point I'm obviously concerned about the early game pacing and it like games ending in 5 minutes and stuff. But when one of the things that happened when you recorded those games that were happening like right after your move basically, and it was just like this like set of like sub 5 minute games. like one of the reasons why that happened, for one example, is that the economy actually scaled up pretty quickly. The worker training time was slower or shorter back then, and now we made it slower. We made it take longer. So it's 15 seconds for Terran and Protoss and 12 seconds for Zerg. And there's an open question as to whether we change that to be 15 for everything, but obviously Zerg spend their workers on buildings, so it's a bit different in that respect.
Yep.
Now, I look at that and I think to myself, like, this is an opportunity for the game to now take longer to actually scale up. And it should be something that we keep in mind, is like, especially if we're adding more buildings that you have to build as Zerg, then you have to spend more of your workers on them. And, having all of these features for how the system can, like, basically making it so that it scales up slower. I'm less concerned about, like, oh, this guy will get Hydrock access too fast, especially if the units take longer to actually kill other units because of the changes we've made to the general stat paradigm and stuff. So at that point, it's like, well, now you can make decisions and you can still, like, decide, I'm going to do a Hydrock opener instead of a Quasrock opener, where I think in 1v1s especially, you probably always want to do Quasrock in the current paradigm. I don't actually know if that's true, but it feels like that's probably the case.
It feels like it, yeah.
You can't really, like, realistically, like you're saying, you can't fast expand and also do a Hydrock. I mean, I guess maybe you could expand first on really safe maps or something, but because you have to get the minerals for the hatch and then you have to get gas for the Hydrock after, it's like currently not very possible. So it's probably fine to make that adjustment and, like, still sort of tool out some of those things. I agree with your estimation that Cyprians are pretty powerful, and one of the things is probably related to their line trace, because now you can't really beat them by having a durable front line. The front line doesn't absorb the shots.
You can't just spread apart your units anymore, because, again, it's the approach issue.
Yeah.
You're still converging onto this one small unit. They're going to get multi-hits in generally.
I think reducing their attack speed a little bit will help with that if they prove to still be a little bit too oppressive for my liking, because I do also feel like they're pretty bad. I mean, one of the things that was floated as maybe reducing the range of the bunker advantage or something, because then now they don't hit as hard. But I wouldn't want to necessarily nerf every unit that goes into a bunker because of one unit that can go into a bunker. So I have to evaluate, like, do I maybe make it so that Cyprians themselves just have one less range, so that they're a little bit more vulnerable to being aggressed upon and approached. Like, approaching the unit is actually more feasible if they have one less range. So that's another thing I can think about. But I think right now, if I'm not mistaken, they only have 6 range, and that's not an incredible amount. So yeah, it's
like when you're on a ledge plus in a bunker, now it's 9 range. And that's 69, and that's 3.
No, actually, cliff advantage gives you 2, bunker gives you 2, so that's actually 10.
Oh, bunker is 2. I thought it was 1.
No, that was what people were saying, is maybe remove it down to 1. So, but
it's not 3.
It's not 3.
Now you got to go all the way up to 12.
Bunkers turn units into ion cannons, obviously. So. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of pointing, like a lot of consternation about how, hey, this one unit is, like, really strong or whatever, and we got to figure those cases out. But that's a lot easier to do in an environment. It's just a lot easier to manage your play and your, like, feel like that you had a shot and that things are more fair when you're in a situation that requires you to, or allows you to react to the threat, whatever the threat is. You know what I mean? Like, if I'm playing a game and my army gets evaporated without me really feeling like I could have known that it was getting evaporated, and that does happen in the old paradigm a lot more than it happens now, like, that feels less fair than, maybe me getting surprised and then put at a disadvantage, but me still being able to micro my way out of it or manage that fight so that I don't lose as much as I could have, or I kill more than I could have otherwise. And then I can be like, okay, well, that was a overall maybe not a great move, and it was a loss, but I can still, the game isn't over because of that. And I was also still able to respond to it somewhat and to sort of stop the bleeding or whatever before it got out of hand. Like, being able to do that is important. And I don't think that realistically it was very possible in the old model of how we conceptualized the stats and how we scaled them. So I'm looking forward to the fruits of this approach and seeing, sort of evaluating what they are and, like, how well everything works together. Because if we're able to comfortably move out to a game that does have that less volatility and less, instantaneous resolution of combat, then it's just going to be, I think, a more interesting game. Like you were talking about the situation where you had this engagement with the Uptectons against the Penumbra, and it's like, if we can have more fights that are closer to that, where you have this push and pull in the middle of the fight, and you can like update your positioning, and you can sort of do stuff. Like not all of them are going to last as long, and some of them will last even longer. But if the fights generally give you more room for both players to actually be interacting, then I think that's just better in general, and it will allow you to have more. You'll get a better glimpse of what the intended sort of like gameplay really is of the game, because the whole point is to use these units that have interesting abilities and passives and characteristics and stuff. And so hopefully we can actually adjust everything necessary to bring it in line with what needs to be done, because we've completely overhauled how piercing works now, the line trace stuff. We've really heavily updated that. We could, in theory, implement the kinetic penetration idea where it only penetrates if you have enough armor pen, and if you have less armor pen than the enemy has armor, then it doesn't. It gets absorbed by whoever that victim is instead of piercing them. And then maybe that even helps, because now you actually can use a front line against units that have that characteristic. That was something that we had originally envisioned for Cosmonic Retail in Antikythera, but we didn't have a functioning line trace system until basically yesterday when Veek overhauled it completely. So it's if that is as bug free and as like robust as it seems to be, I feel like we can probably afford to do that, and then it'll reward. This is another conversation we were having, is like, do you want to like at what point does APM cost in order to get cost efficiency or resource value or whatever out of your unit come into the depiction? And it's like, if Cyprians now have to be, positioned in a really solid way, and then also attack a unit, like pick good targets that will actually get penetrated by the piercing, then it becomes more about like, you're kind of gating their power behind good skill in order to really maximize the usage of the unit. And I think that's healthier, because you are rewarding skill, but you're also making it so that like a skillful opponent can structure their army and structure their approach in such a way that like, well, my Harakans are here, so in the front line, and so you aren't going to get past Ahmed, dude. So like, you can kind of do stuff like that in the world where we're talking about with that feature, and that probably just generally makes the whole system a bit cleaner, where you have counterplay. And I guess that's another thing about the time to kill thing, right? Is like, you actually have time to do counterplay. Like we added counterplay to all these things. We made it so that like Stasis Field has a wind up, and like, certain units have an attack charge animation. Like you think about the ion cannon changes, and it's like, okay, it fires the beacon and then shoots the beacon, and it's like, that's all cool. But the question becomes like, where do you I don't know. The question definitely becomes like, if you can't respond, if you can't react in time, then is there really any counterplay? Because like, most situations come up and you can't really react fast enough because the battles end too fast. Like, then it doesn't really matter if there's counterplay, because it doesn't really get actuated in most cases. So that's when we think about like, okay, if we slow the game's combat down a bit, then now you have opportunity to make those interesting positional choices that you were talking about in the Penumbra fight. And then you have the opportunity to move around and play stuff out. And I guess the question I would ask is like, if more of the fights were like that Optecton Penumbra fight, in the way of, obviously all the units behave differently, but in the way that like you had that back and forth, don't you think that would just be a more interesting game at that point?
Yeah, there's definitely a balance to obtain, where you're looking for a mix between individual decisions having impact, and then being able to make those decisions at all to begin with. And like, I feel like tier 1 unit, like military fights, was fairly reasonable in many cases, but workers, like before the health changes especially, didn't really scale to that, so that kind of led to a lot of volatility. But it's also like, the game ends quite early, because you can be set behind so easily by like one mine or a couple worker kills,
or the map distances tend to be short. So in those other games, it was like one Dracon's in your base. You pretty much have to fight it, or it's just going to freely at least deny your mining, which is going to set you behind to the point you're never going to recover, because now there's going to be another Dracodon and you can't keep up with the military units, and it's just going to keep snowballing. That's obviously more of an issue when it happens a lot, where I will see something on the map, and of course if you attack it, it'll give a notice. Well, it's supposed to give a notice, it doesn't always. But if you assume it does, then all you need to do is just move your units right on top of them and then get the first shot off.
Oh yeah, sure.
And even if you react fast, if it's something like Valkyries versus air units, it doesn't matter.
Well, what works really well as a tactic is if this is especially true for workers because of the way that they work is if they start attacking they'll start attacking something that's like making collision contact with them, and if they do that, then they won't flee from being attacked. So you can cheese people by like killing their scout when they aren't looking by moving like a Quasilisk next to their worker, getting the worker to attack the Quasilisk, and then just fucking kiting it and killing it. And it's like, oh well, fuck, it didn't even flee, so it didn't even like save itself or whatever the way that it normally would. So I do that trick all the time, and but you can obviously do it with combat units, because if they're attacking, they're definitely not going to be fleeing, and they probably wouldn't flee anyway if they can retaliate. So, getting them to engage, and then they've blown their attack cooldown, which could be quite high depending on what the case is, and so the micro potential is even more limited. So stuff like that can actually happen, but I would still like that to be like, you want to incentivize people to be proactive with their play. So like you're saying, there's definitely a balance to be struck where you want there to be some sort of aggressor's advantage in certain situations. You just don't want it to be so one-sided that reacting to the fight basically means you can't, because the fight's over by the time you hit the spacebar to get your notice or whatever. So that can definitely be pretty rough.
Saving and loading back into a mission may create strange behavior, such as seeing campaign triggers, gaining vision or possession over units or buildings, or in-game mission timers not working correctly. I've had a lot of issues with the fucking save system that I've been trying to figure out in Apex, and I'm just some random fucking nobody trying to work a third-party save engine. This is an actual commercial developer that is more fucked than I am, with like 2 weeks of work. Yikes!
Absolute yikes.
Yikes! Big yikes! That's a down, dude.
Why or how does anybody fail to save, bro? Didn't you guys learn from Jesus? Jesus saved a lot. There's a really ancient joke where that's the punchline. It's like this really long-winded thing where Jesus and Satan challenge each other to like do a bunch of work on a computer, and then the power goes out and Satan doesn't have any work left, and Jesus saved, so he's fine. It's the shittest joke of all time, honestly. Like you can tell it too, and the way you tell it is by like taking 2 minutes to tell it, and then at the very end you say that, and then they just like want to kill you because you wasted all their time for that shitty punchline. So it's really satisfying to tell that at parties. Just saying. But yeah, so I think in general, if the battles take a little bit longer and you get that little bit extra time, you're definitely in a good spot compared to what we normally have seen hitherto. But also,
it'll be interesting to see anyways.
Yeah, like I think if the battles, like there is a potential, like you were talking about units, you lose workers or whatever, it sets you farther behind. Because and that's true in the case of the build times, because obviously now it takes longer to build workers. So
yeah,
you're out workers for that extra amount of time. So even though it takes longer to scale up the economy, it also means that worker harassment can be a bit more effective. But I think that's just going to incentivize you to build additional worker production queues. So embassies as Protoss, or quarries as Terran. And Zerg obviously go for.
Well, if it's in like the first 5 minutes of the game, the embassy is way too expensive an investment because it's like 50 gas.
And 200 minerals, so it's not cheap.
Yeah. And for a quarry, then quarry is a little bit more reasonable. It's still some gas income, though, so depending on what you're doing, if you're going bio, then it probably wasn't a big issue.
Well, it does.
But
It crucially locks out your production of workers for like 30, 40 seconds or whatever. So
it takes a little while to pay for itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's
With
obviously
Zerg, it's a little easier because you usually are going to go for a Larvosk early on.
Yeah.
Especially if it's one of those shorter range maps. So you can kind of bounce back from it. But if you're under constant aggression, then however many workers worth of minerals is still a lot of units.
Right. Well, I have noticed that recently I made it so that K-grants were 50 instead of 75. So your initial colony is actually cheaper to build. So that should help with that, and also help with the fact that like you're already losing a worker when you build a K-grant for whatever reason. So now it should be a bit easier to maintain, like to actually go for static defense. It does probably mean that an early Larvosk is kind of like perfunctory, but I think if you're fast expanding, you can delay it.
It's
a
still
little bit,
gas.
So, yeah.
So it's really only going to be like that. Might only really be an issue if everybody just sticks to Quasric forever.
Right. Yeah, sure. And maybe if they're not doing that, then like they can spare the, because now you've got 25 more gas if you go a Hydra, because it's going to be cheaper. If we go for the idea of like making it 50 gas instead, then like suddenly it's more approachable in that respect. And you know, Vic was asking me if I would reduce the cost of the Hydralisk, but I think the idea of the Hydralisk being a pricey investment for like really, if there's a problem, it's that it's not worth the cost that it currently is. And the way that I would solve that is by making it worth that cost instead of
the cost is probably okay, and when its stats are all figured out.
Yeah. I think it's. I think what I really like is that like obviously I made the Quasilisk cheaper and more like less individually effective. What I really like about the relationship that the Zerg has with a bunch of their tier 1 units is like, so the Quasilisk is like a discount Hydra in many ways, but it's more swarmy because you can spam it out more. And it's only 50 minerals now, but it's lower HP and stuff, and they clump up pretty well together, and so they're really susceptible to AoE and stuff. So that's definitely very different than, for example, the Hydra or what have you, where it's like more individually durable, it's more individually powerful in terms of damage, like DPS is higher. Obviously has armor pen associated with it, so it can help you bust buildings, which I think is quite thematic for the unit. That's another thing we're kind of borrowing from default StarCraft, is like you think about all the Hydra busts versus Protoss. And so there's that. And then there's, of course, the Izira core, which maybe also needs some stat figuring out because it's also supposed to be durable. I think if it ends up absorbing stuff like Cyprian shots, it will actually see a lot more circulation because then you can actually have a backline again. So there's like all these things that like we would like to achieve. That we would like to have the case be that there's this sort of push and pull where you do feel like, you know, all of your Quasrock units, the 3 of them do solve different problems or achieve different things, but they all have kind of a similar weakness of like crowd control and like they're kind of individually fragile. Where if you look at the Hydrock units, they're less individually fragile. They're more about like sort of that mid table of durability. And they also dish out a bit more damage, but they're less spammable because of the fact that they're more expensive. And so you get this like mix of this nice little mix of like, okay, well, these guys are going to be good as a stylistic combination with my Quasrock stuff. Like, I do like that we don't feel like we have to go like it's useless to go for a specific structure or whatever, right? Like the Zorkas might be very specialized, but there's still things that the units that it unlocks achieve, right? And those are things that you can't really get the same mile. If you really need like anti-ground crowd control, the Lakizalisk is a really fucking good option. And if you need something that's super good at durability tank-wise, that's the Zoristaleth. And if you need the Gorger core for like, I don't know, for whatever reason you might need a Gorger core for, like the enemy has too many workers in a base and not enough watchdogs, then okay, well that's a good option there. It also is pretty good in ZVZ versus Nather cores and stuff. So like there's many options that these units do that are like, maybe they are in some ways niche like the Zerk is, or maybe they're still needing to be figured out stats wise like some of the Hydrock options. But I like the conceptual idea that you don't have a one-stop shop for the only thing. This is the only thing you're ever going to build. Like Brood War obviously had super fast tech pacing or non-existent tech pacing maybe, where you would just be bum rushing a hive at like 8 minutes in some cases or whatever. But the idea behind, staying with one unit for a while until you get your next unit that's really good. That's something I don't really like at all in RTS games in general. It's like you really shouldn't have a one-stop shop or something. And I think I've already been playing around with some Protoss compositions that mix and match gateways a bit differently. And like obviously everybody likes to spam Draconins, but they're not as effective, especially after all the changes, at dealing with so many different kinds of things. Like their identity is a little bit more about like poking and maybe like they'll overkill like groups of units and stuff. And
Well, with Protoss, I've been able to make Astral Omen first work
there you go.
twice now.
That is going to be a separate thing that we look into at some point. I have a couple of ideas about how we might do it, but I do feel like the unlock everything and have no tech requirements bit is probably not great at the end of the day. You have a huge amount of like, you need to play so many games to understand the race. And even then it's like, well, I guess I'm kind of incentivized to build lower, like inexpensive things first, like Gateway, but like because you can get everything, I think you'll often get choice paralysis. So we'll probably think a little bit more deeply.
Or you get people like me who go Aquifer first.
Yeah. I kind of like that you can do that, especially in team games, but it is a lot of shit to try to keep track of as a player and also as the person who's playing against the Protoss. So it might be better if there was some more... Like, one of the things I've been thinking about, like, tech restrictions about, like, oh, you need the Atlas to get tier 2 and stuff. It's like, one of the things that does is it signals to your opponent who scouts it and also to you, like, as who's the person who sees, like, this structure requires Atlas. Like, it gives a signal of, like, you're making your intention of teching up, a bit clear and... you're taking steps to do that. And I feel like you don't really have that signal as Protoss because you just build whatever structure and you can save up for it without communicating that necessarily. I mean, I guess if they see you going Aquifer first, then they know you're probably doing some sort of weird, like, wacky build. But aside from that, it's like, what really happens, right? And so, like, you have to think about that. So at some point, I think we're going to target that. One of the concepts I had was having a different... like a series of different types of pylons where, like, say the Gateway the Gateway now trains like all sorts of different units, like the Hierophant and the Legionnaire are on the Gateway now. And if you build like a specific pylon next to the Gateway, that's what unlocks them. So it's like environmental.
You can do that now? You can have specific power fuels?
Yeah, I don't know how we would colorize them differently, but I guess in theory it actually wouldn't be too difficult now that I think about it, because we would just have different versions of the same graphic. In theory, that should actually be fine. But we would have like here's pylon type 2, and it unlocks the but it wouldn't just unlock something from the Gateway is the thing. Like that same thing would unlock Panoptis from Stargate or whatever the case may be. It would unlock like X unit from say it unlocks like 2 units at 5 different structures or whatever, right? So it's like when you put down that infrastructure, it's unlocking something of a certain kind of theme or what have you. That's actually something that we plan for in the first game that we're working on right now. That's one of the race's mechanics for how they tech up. So that's where I get the idea from, is like something I've already planned on, and I feel like it would actually suit the Protoss quite well, but it's just a matter of whether or not we can make it work.
How's that going, by the way, your game? Wasn't that supposed to be out by now?
The demo was in various stages of completion. However, we had a talk with Jonathan Blow, and he was like, if you don't have something resembling the final cut of what your art is going to look like, a lot of people will just dismiss it out of hand. So we decided.
I know you mentioned something about the art before, but I didn't realize they were looking for final cut art.
It doesn't have to be final cut. It just has to not be like what we usually call programmer art, where it's just like
call arts,
the basic shit. Yeah,
Allegra,
like fucking primitive geometry.
Warcraft 3.
Yeah, basically. So it doesn't have to be final cut, but we also need to communicate to them what give them concept art probably, and like here's what the final thing could look like, or here's like
you can give them my Dick Swastika.
Oh yeah.
That can be official concept art.
That's true, actually. That's very useful. Imagine getting funding when you do that, honestly.
So how far along are you? What were you working on?
Right now, I'm doing some progress on the demo campaign. I'm on mission 2 right now, and we've got like a pretty big... one of the biggest things we want to stress is the wacky environment that you're in. The environment is basically like... imagine a planet that was as big as a galaxy. That's basically the environment. So it's like very much like wacky. It's almost like science fantasy, because obviously the likelihood of such a mega structure being able to exist is probably, it certainly exists in opposition to our current scientific understanding. I'll put it to you that way. So I'm not really worried about like it being realistic to humans, but the idea is that like the first mission takes place in a simple enough looking environment, but then as you fight your way towards the enemy location, because your objective is of course to destroy the enemy base because it is an RTS campaign. The enemy base is situated right next to a very peculiar kind of terrain. I guarantee nobody's ever seen terrain like this in an RTS before. So basically the idea is you go there and you're like, it's sort of like a mountain, but it's not a mountain, and you have to climb it in the second mission. So like the second mission is all about engaging with that kind of thing and like really starting to see how this connects out. So it's like a really abstract in some ways environment, but we really want to stress that part, and that's where we're getting a lot of the art progress being like focusing on right now is the environment stuff and getting our own tile stuff set up. So
that's all Balethal?
Yeah, Balethal's doing all of that. I'm having him sort of set me up at some point because he's very busy with his own personal shit. So as a result, he hasn't been able to get too much progress done. And that's the main thing that I think is holding us back now. Because I can do at least like I can make progress on some placeholder stuff for the units and the structures, and that's what I've been doing when I'm not doing level design work. But
so you really have been having an emphasis on Blender then?
Yeah, unfortunately. I'm learning some stuff. I do like daily fucking doodles or whatever, just to like remind me how it all works. But a lot of the stuff that I'm doing right now is like, maybe it'll double as like CMBW assets in the future or whatever. But at the very least, we have like all of our own art in the game right now. Like we stripped out all the StarCraft stuff. So the biggest thing that I probably need to learn how to do, because I've been doing like projectiles and stuff, I definitely need to learn how to do like particles and anything that's related to like, weapon hit effects and stuff like that. So.
I know a lot about that stuff, but nothing about Blender, so I can't help you. Anything in Blender's interface is 1,000 times more tedious than anything else I've used. So
right.
I couldn't. What I can tell you is that there are a lot of software out there, independent software. Many of it's probably even like small free things you can find that are actually for generating particles. I don't know any that are good. There was ones that Blizzard used, but they were too difficult for me to get into. But there is software out there for rendering flip-like textures that you might be able to make use of, but maybe also keeping it inside Blender will be more usable in general, because it will probably be the tool you end up sticking with over the long term, no matter who ends up like John A or Balethal or anyone else who ends up making stuff where it will probably benefit from having a single unified pipeline. So
yeah, we're hoping to even hook it up such that like we can. So actually, exactly like what John A did, Solstice was the guy who hooked up some tool that lets us push one button and render it into a GRP format and put it into where our
just like
MPQ
Max script,
is.
I imagine, just in Python.
Yeah, exactly. So we want that both ways for our stuff for Antikythera, because ideally we would be able to compile it into an atlas or something that is like, optimized for... we just don't want there to be like heavy load times or heavy file size, so we want something that's like good for both. And whatever we choose for that is like, we have a solution for now, but we would like to make it better in the future. And if we can do something like that turns it into like turns the model into sprite sheets or whatever automatically, that would be really great, because that just means less work trying to fix up the compositor or do all this other weird post-processing shit. And it's like, if we can just automate that, it makes our lives a lot easier. But having a good pipeline, that's absolutely like 100% a huge deal. And that's one of the reasons why I at least want to be passingly familiar with how to do every single phase of the setup, because if I can also start doing like terrain work, then I can basically decouple the reliance that the project currently has on other people's schedules in that respect, because I can dedicate a ton of time to whatever task. I will say it's been a bit challenging to have to wear as many hats, like do all this work of let me work on Blender and let me also do the everything else.
Absolutely.
Like, it is pretty it's a bit of a drain, because I have to I have to learn.
Now you know
the
what I've been
tasks.
doing for however many years, right?
Yeah.
Like that's all part of the game. Is you got to get into all these different tools, and like as was the case for Apex, is I try to switch to Blender, and the whole project came to a complete dead stop. And I had to abandon it because Blender is just too annoying to deal with, and there's too many complicated things I need to do in it. That's why I'm keeping an eye on you guys, because I'm hoping one day you get to the skill set that I can start conscripting you for my own shit.
With any luck, man. I mean, I would like that to be the case, because not only
Most
would
of
I
it's
be able
really
to-
simple, but it's still like organics and stuff like
Yeah.
that, remodeling organics and UVing and wrapping. And I know that's kind of going to be a while off. So
Yeah, the whole UV map stuff it's like a fucking black art to me. I have no idea what anything.
well, I can tell you that Blender does do that a lot better than Max does.
Really? Okay.
Max's UV unwrapping is awful. Even the little bit of work I did for like StarCraft 2 was not pleasant. And Blender's system in general is just better for it. There's still like what little I've done. There's so many times it's like, I wish this could just do this. Just could like split this up precisely how I want it. Maybe it does. There's probably like Blender or Python scripts that can do what I'm looking for. That's kind of part of the problem with Blender too, is when you have these feat software and everything gets split up into all these different third-party plugins.
Yeah.
There may be plugins that do what you want to do really quite elegantly, but fucking finding them, vetting them, having the right version of the software is its own massive headache.
Absolutely. Yeah, and also like all of the add-ons that I see are usually for exorbitant prices anyway, so
Yeah.
trying to find something that works for my budget of nothing currently is not great, not easy. So.
It's definitely an issue. That's why I try to stay far away from it as possible. But like, I think I got to bring a chunk of my assets into Blender that I ported out of 3ds Max because the smoothing groups on them are fucked up. And I think that's just the way that the Actor X importer from UModel is not capable of bringing in the smoothing groups or something like that from the ported models. And there's a few of them that actually have just such fucked smoothing that I can't just ignore it. And some of them that have clipping issues or other stuff like that. So I can't fix those in Unreal. They're going to have to go into Blender, and that's not going to be fun. And then, of course, there's the multitude of things that actually need to edit, which are much more difficult work.
Yeah, I mean,
Max
on the one hand, I
has
just
ways
feel
of
like
dealing with it, but
if I can tap into whatever it's necessary to be competent in that environment of doing the graphical stuff, it does liberate you a lot, because now you can actually create shit for your project without needing to edit other people's stuff. Like, I've been trying to do a bunch of model from scratch, whatever object, and like a very simple thing I did a while ago was like, hey, I need this knife model or this like sword model or whatever. So that's for like one of the units in our game. Let me just model that instead of like copying it or downloading it from some source. It's like, well, I can just model it. It's not really that complicated. You know, I can follow a guide or whatever and then get the necessary like, or, you know, starting to learn how to model from reference images or whatever the fuck. It's like, it's not impossible to do stuff like that where you're basically like moving vertexes around. Vertices.
And then it gets so much harder when you try to do organics. I've tried to model clothing at least like, not even exaggerating, like 100 times, and it just can't do it. There's like 80 billion different ways to do it, and none of them work for me. So it's yeah, maybe better off looking into something like Fabulous Designer or whatever. But it's like, how do I get this into Unreal? How do I get it fitted to a model of mine? Like,
yeah,
there's all these things I don't even know how to approach. It's like, at this stage, I'd rather just focus on trying to learn blueprints and making actual game mechanics in Apex rather than looking at Blender and just hoping one day a solution comes up for stuff like player character stuff. Because at this stage, like for all my life, I've been like, I need a skill. I'm going to try to just smash my face through it, because you didn't really have much of a choice. But at this point, because of the way that time has become, because so much of my time is consumed by real life, especially in the last couple of years, it's like, I don't even have the energy to think like that anymore. I can't get into these graphics as much as, because Blender is like, if all you were doing was Blender,
it's still a many-year commitment to get to even any shred degree of competency for most people. Like, I've been working with graphics since 2001. I've been doing 3D stuff since 2001, and I don't know the first fucking thing about making organics despite trying to do it for so long. And to even try to build the hard surface meshes that I was making in 3ds Max and Blender would be impossible. The tools are just so incredibly unalike. And 3ds Max has changed so much in its updates, and it's become so much more clunky and cumbersome and bloated and cluttered that it's hard to even do basic operations in that. So it's like, I may as well just stick with Blender because that's where a lot of this support is coming in for Unreal anyways. But then that guy had a lot of real life issues, the guy who made Mr. Mannequin's tools, and that plugin hasn't been updated in forever when it was supposed to be updated about 2 years ago now. And the retargeting thing was never made for it, which was going to all these like male models and some of the female models that are only slightly different than the mannequin. You'll be able just to plug them into this thing and push a button or two, and now they're going to be on the mannequin skeleton. Well, that never happened. So and then it's like, I'm not at the skill level where I could easily do that. I reweighted one model, but I can't like fix that model. And it's like, to get to the point where I can fix this asset, let's say add the fingers that are missing, fix the existing fingers, fix some of the smaller proportional issues. That's still like 4 or 5 years of very dedicated effort to try to learn the program to figure out how to use. And it's just like, I got better things to do than that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it would be really nice if I stumbled into somebody who is really proficient at Blender, kind of like what happened with John A, honestly, but who was like, all right, let's do it. I buy into your vision completely. It's epic. Let's just make all this shit. That would really simplify a lot of things. And to the same point, I'm very grateful for the people who have contributed, like John A, like Balathal, who, DF and all these other people who have contributed on the art side, and then Veek, who's done all this programming stuff, and iQuery before him. And, it's like the people, and you, Mesk, for like the stuff that you've done for basically like contributing to the actual ideation process of thinking about all of these things and trying to like go deeper in the RTS design. It's like that part of the community. I was, in a similar boat to you when it came to that campaign creations shit, where it just like all these communities became super like disinterested in progress and all this other stuff. And it when I was younger, it kind of it definitely made me think maybe like this is every community and it's just overrated. But what I'm seeing when you really do have this vision of like quality and you're strong in your resolve to bring it through, you can surround yourself with people who are as interested as you are in bringing the thing to life and, contributing to it in their own way. And in many ways, like all the projects that I work on and all the things that I'm doing would be inferior most likely if it was just me doing it and nobody else. Like, forget the stuff that's meaningfully different about like the art assets or whatever. It's just like even some of the concepts I wouldn't have gotten there, at least not as quickly, by myself. So I think that part is pretty nice. It can definitely be nice to surround yourself with people who are used, like in your case it's a lot of like HKS with Unreal and whatnot, and it's like like you're not gonna there are cases where you can actually be stronger with a community or with a group of people or whatever, then like it doesn't all have to be like the AAA example we were giving before, where it's like, yeah, Blizzard just has this fucking factory pipeline and they don't communicate to anybody, and so nothing ever gets done correctly or whatever, right?
It always helps to have a few people you can depend upon that you can learn from, and then they can learn from you. I know HKS has been pining for the time where I'm competent enough in Unreal that I can actually help him with shit, because he has issues trying to, like, there's that D&D client he's been trying to work on and off on for however long that runs into constant technical limitations and problems. And it's like there's nowhere that he can really go to try to solve a lot of these issues. Like the Steam sockets thing is really just weird, where it just doesn't want to connect or work. And it's like Steam still uses a command line thing to push updates and stuff to their service. Like, it's all really old and not very well documented, and there's just been issues with it that we just haven't been able to figure out. And he's in a situation where there's no one he can really go to for this kind of problem. So the most he can do is just like comb the internet searching for stuff. And I'm not at a stage where I can help him really with anything. It's like when he runs into issues with something and I try to solve them, It's just I am just so in over my head. I can only just like throw out ideas that just are completely off the mark and won't amount to anything.
Well, that's actually in some cases that's exactly how I help Veek solve problems. Is like I basically get everything wrong about my estimation of the problem, so he has to go back to like the most basic way of explaining something. This happened with pathfinding. I forget what the exact thing was, but I was like, well, what if the pathfinding is breaking because of like this thing that absolutely can't happen, and I'm just an idiot for suggesting. And because he was like having to explain it in such detail, he eventually was like, oh wait, that's what's broken. And so I did help him, so it counts.
Yeah, sometimes just having another perspective can help, because it makes you reevaluate what's going on. So,
and also vocalizing everything from the beginning can be a nice way of just, especially for programming problems, it's like you really are walking through, like stepping through the code in your head as you're like saying it, and going through like, and this happens and this happens and this should happen, but this doesn't happen. And then it can eventually click. So I think that whole collaborative aspect can be very fruitful, even if it's done in a silly way, like what we were just describing. But I don't know. It's, as I like something that is so obvious with art specifically is like when you have full control over the assets, like when I have these, infantry graphics or whatever, or any graphic, just pick a graphic that I've recently added to CMBW. It's like, well, as soon as I do that with like the Vagrant or the Legionnaire that John A did, it's like, well, suddenly like the fact that the graphic is different and maybe bigger or whatever means that like, okay, the unit has to have more durability because it has to match the fucking size of the unit. And so like it makes you actualize the concept completely differently because you actually have full control. Like I gave the Legionnaire a bit of extra melee range because he doesn't use swords. He's not a zealot recolor anymore. He uses like a side lance or whatever. And so this like that actually helps you like make the unit even more distinct and whatever, because it has the visual, and then you don't get confused as to whether you're looking at a zealot or a legionnaire anymore, which is nice. It's like that's like a simple example, but like when the Olympian came out and it was like twice the fucking size of the original graphic that was used as a placeholder, it's like, oh, okay, well suddenly now we have the Olympian, and now it's like, okay, let's make it more durable, right? And so I think all of that works out pretty well. If you can get to that point. Modeling organics, definitely a tough part. In Blender, if you don't actually need the clothes to animate, which doesn't help you at all, because obviously you do, really the way that they cheat around that is by like the low poly style, if you want to call it that, of modeling means that you just like select the faces that you want clothes on,
and then extrude them or whatever.
Yeah, you duplicate them, Alt S to like scale the size by whatever that does. It does it differently, and then you extrude, as you're saying, and it's like you set some other material properties and whatever, and it looks like clothes, and it's just on them, and so but it doesn't move, and but it
will actually keep bone weights. So if you have it assigned to the armature,
right, yeah,
it will animate like the body would, but you can't move it very much. Like if you're trying to make it conforming or changing the positioning or whatever, then the weights and everything are going to change too, and you're going to have issues. I did that actually for my initial tests, and I was not happy with the results, especially since the topology of the model I'm working with is really bad and it's really low poly. It really didn't give me anything that looked like clothing to begin with. So it's definitely a big challenge there. Yeah, you were talking about adding the graphics and stuff like that, and it just made me think of the stuff I was working on recently in Apex, where I've just kind of started trying to get back into the routine of doing daily work for it.
Right.
And what I was doing recently was adding in sound effects for landing on the ground.
I saw there was like a cancel attack sound effect or something. Like
yes. Yeah. That was a big one I've been searching for a long time. I had one candidate before, but it was too long. This one's a hybrid of two sounds. I have spent, I don't know how many hundreds of hours of my life searching for anime sound CDs. Trying to figure out what Japanese audio CDs there are and if they're available. I can't even find, I found the name of one guy who is a part of Toei, whatever how you pronounce it, that did release a CD. And I can't remember his name. I have it somewhere, but the CD was on Amazon and it doesn't exist. That's not in stock anymore. Otherwise, I might have actually seriously considered buying it. Finding a source for that stuff's absolutely impossible. So I was looking for a variety of sounds. I just want to like go through their entire library of sounds. I've been searching for Japanese instrument sounds. I've been searching for all kinds of stuff I can use for reeds, weapons, stuff like that.
all the stuff you hear in anime and related stuff. And I just starting to like lose my fucking mind because this stuff is actually impossible to find. So I was trying to find, like, I have in my head kind of like a rough idea of what I want stuff to sound like, but there's a lot of cases where it comes to the cancel sound where it's kind of like I need to discover something to know what I want it to sound like, and it has to be something really specific because it has to, first of all, it has to stand out. So it has to be super iconic and it has to stand out, but not so much as to be overbearing.
Well, especially for something that's like, I mean, canceling is pretty impactful, obviously, but it's like, if you're, depending on what the use case is, like, I want something to be iconic and different, but also exactly as noisy as it should be for whatever the purpose is. So,
and it also has to be something I can blend with other sounds because each type of projectile is going to have its own distinct subset of sound to it. So when you cancel a fireball, you'll hear fire sounds. If you cancel lightning, you'll hear lightning sounds, so on and so forth.
Right.
So
well, think about it like there was a description. I think it was on this show, but way back, like in the early 20 episodes or something. You said something to the effect of like your style of the way that you try to think about audio is similar to how anime does it in the first place, where like, or I think maybe you were also describing the visual cues in shoot 'em up games, where it's like this thing is big and like boisterous and like makes like it really tells you exactly what it is, and then it immediately moves on so that the next thing can take center stage. Like the performance is instantaneous with that, and that's something that I definitely took to heart as like an audio designer or whatever, like audio engineering stuff, is like make everything work properly for what it is, and then get out of the fucking way so that obviously it helps in Brood War that by default, I mean, we don't have this anymore, but you only had like 8 sound channels anyway.
Yes.
So you really had to make sure your audio
really
was
cutting
condensed.
corners.
Yeah.
Chopping off every tail and being as concise as possible. Yeah. So I was just on like a path of soul searching for these sounds.
Yep.
And I kind of lucked out. I think it was yesterday or the day before. I can't remember now. It's all a blur. There's actually a game rip for Dragon Ball Fighter Z, and that has a bunch of sounds in it that are in reasonable quality. So there was that. There was looking through the Blaze Blue sounds and some other similar stuff, or some of the stuff's in reasonably high audio quality. So I just kind of like gave up searching for the CDs and was just looking for game rips at that point. There's probably more out there I can find, but then there was like this anime I ripped a lot of sounds out of anime over the years, but I don't know where they are. They're somewhere. And but that was when I was doing Retribution, so it's not really the stuff I'm looking for now. So I kind of like need to reevaluate anime that I have access to, any of them in high audio quality, and go through and see if I can find shit in it. Because it's like oftentimes you're not even looking for very sophisticated sounds. Yeah, you're just looking for something that really just fits the thing, or something you can mix with something else. Now, I have access to a huge amount of sound assets. There's the stuff HKS has sent me from deals on groupies and stuff. There's all the sound CDs I have had over the years, but none of them have these kinds of sounds in them. A lot of them are very kind of like, if I was to say, I would say like synthesized digital audio or live recordings. I basically have things that fit into that. The synthesized digital audio generally does not fit what I'm looking for in the audio for this, where I'm looking for generally a very realistic sounding thing with style to it. So you might think of the fire that I'm using for the Fire Magus, or the sounds that I created, because there's a huge chunk in there I pulled from Retribution, actually. It's just straight up. The Type 2's launch and impact are sounds I created for the Undead, same with the Voidhound's attack. And then there is some Warframe sounds I'm using as well. There's the Ash teleport sound I think I used as a placeholder for the teleport sound off of the Voidhound as well. So those are the kind of sounds I'm looking for. But a lot of the other stuff I have access to, it sounds like too synthesized. It's too like cheap sounding, or like some of those sounds are very useful because you can mix them together. And this is the reason why I wanted to get into Reaper, is because it's a better, as far as I understand, a better multi-track editor than Audition is. It's supposed to be, from what I've watched, an evolution of Audition's interface. But that was something I held off because of the whole moving situation. So it is something I might actually try to get into before the end of the year. And the other stuff is like live recordings, where it's like they're useful, but they're not useful for this read stuff, because I have to edit them a lot in a way that I'm not familiar with doing, because I've never really had to do massive processing work like this. It's not in my skill set. My skill set for processing is related to voices and casting and cleaning, and then flanging voices and stuff like that. I'm not used to taking individual sound effects and trying to make a super clean reiteration of it.
Yeah.
A lot of my editing with sound effects comes into making distortion for things like the undead, the Kato sounds for Zychronesha and Retribution and stuff like that. All those came out super well. But when I'm trying to make a raid sound like this, it is absolutely not my skill set. So what I'm actually looking for is generally like analog sound effects, is I believe what a lot of the old Japanese stuff is. Now I'm looking for specific things from it. So the best way to find that at this stage is I gave up on the sound CDs because I'm not going to find them. Is just to find games with them and find reps for the games. So, or rip them from the anime and clean it myself, because that I can, and have done in the past. If I can find now what I know what I'm looking for, I might be able to find them now. It's very time consuming. So I did get a little lucky. I did find a couple sound effects. There's a couple of others that are not being used yet. They'll probably be used for other events. There is just a few different things I've reprocessed or otherwise put in there and cleaned up that I found that when I put those in, it absolutely adds a lot. Like is really like, especially the cancel sound. The particle has existed for a long time in its first initial state, and I didn't want to iterate on the particle until I had a sound effect for it, because then I have a more complete picture of how I want to evolve them both. To have them both set up gives me a kind of a path that I can kind of visualize where they're going to meet up together to be perfectly synced to each other. Now, currently, I think that the sound effect is ever so slightly too long. There's actually two sound effects. There's a ringing, and then there is the actual main body of the sound. The main body of the sound is I'm probably going to condense it ever so slightly and make it slightly faster. And then lower the pitch ever so slightly because I rose the pitch from it. So now I can understand, like, now that I have a basis that I can work off of, then that's where my skill set will come in, where I can actually make the tweaks necessary to it to get where I want it to be. And just having that complete picture allows me to now reassess that. Whereas before, to invest a lot of time into trying to polish that stuff without the whole complete picture is kind of like you're not really sure what the final shape is going to be, but you're trying to carve it out. So you don't really have a very cohesive direction of where you want to take this. So the other thing I was adding as well was sounds for the stinger attacks. For when you prime the attack, there's these little clinking sounds. And I went through a few iterations of those to try to make them something you can hear, but not very dominant. And then I ended up with, I think, 2 or 3 different sounds that kind of sounded acceptable at the time. And those ones will probably change more. But now I have an idea of where I want to change them to. So that was kind of part of the goal after the move, is not necessarily to jump into the very heavy work right away, but to kind of go back to the stuff that I've been putting off, the audio polish in particular, to just enable the functionality for this stuff. And then along the way, I started doing some house cleaning, setting up collision profiles and stuff like that HK's told me I should probably do just to keep stuff consistent. Setting up a channel for the IK collision that I should have done forever ago, because I was having an issue where I needed to trace against water. Like in Laviana, there's that river. In order for you to trace against the water to play the sounds, I had to be tracing against visibility. But in order to have that colliding with visibility, now the IK would collide with it, so your feet would stand on the water. That was obviously no good. So I had to actually create the IK channel finally and start setting up all that stuff. So it's good to get that done now before I start actually really heavily working on these levels. Obviously, that one's just a demo map that's got lots of holes and gaps and uneven terrain that's going to get kind of flattened out and worked on. And having all this stuff consistently set up just lets me go a long way. So that's probably where we're going to work on now, is just trying to connect a few of those little dots, these little nebulous things, get them all hooked up, see what they sound like, play through it, with that, and then start tweaking in those, and then start moving back up into the big things. So definitely feeling that push to have a little bit more polished of a groundwork to kind of go off of, and then we're going to probably start looking at big stuff. So I definitely feel like that there was something I was going to say that was related to the earlier discussions, but I can't remember now since it was earlier into this.
Yeah, it's all right. We've
I don't
pretty
remember.
much run the course, I think, of the episode. We're closing in
Yeah.
on that 2-hour 45 mark. So I think all in all, it's it's always nice to hear about progress from both of us. Always nice to be making that progress. So I'm sure you feel the same way now that you're getting back into the swing of things in that respect. Finally being able to be a bit more productive, although obviously you still have to catch every single delivery thrown at you, it seems like.
Yeah. There
That's
was
a
like
good
3
meme.
packages outside the door, so someone let him in. And
Oh,
it was just like a pile of shit in front of the door. I guess that's going to be just remaining an eternal constant.
Yes. Yeah. Classic. Well,
At least I didn't have to go down 3 times.
That's
Because that
true.
would have been 3, and I wouldn't have been able to live with myself.
yeah, there was some stupid 3 thing that happened, but I can't remember it. So I'll leave you with this anecdote instead. I was my brother works at the same spot that I work at now, except he does overnight stuff, and I'm leaving at the end of the night.
Do you leave him things?
Not well, kind of.
Do you hide things for him to discover in the office space?
It's more like I just do stupid shit anyway, and I know he's gonna see it, so that's always good. But there was one thing where, as I was walking out, I was leaving the parking lot. On top of a trash can next to a bus stop, there was a cake a cookie cake that somebody had gotten from our store actually, and the fucking caption, it was totally intact except for like missing one piece, and it was opened, like the protective casing of it or whatever was opened already, and so I'm sure everybody thought it was poisoned or something because they just left it there. But the fucking you know how normally you'll have like some message on a cake that says like happy birthday or whatever. The message on this one was just virginity rocks with an exclamation point. And I was like, what the fuck? How does somebody make a cake like that? First of all, how do you even have the balls to suggest such a thing? Second of all, imagine being the person who put that there, like whose job it was, who was getting paid to write virginity rocks on a fucking cookie cake. And then they didn't even eat it. Fucking absolute travesty. But yeah, so that's my little TISM story for you. There's there's all sorts of TISM stories, but that was definitely one of them. We started playing Divinity again because we have nothing to play. We played the second game, and we have Kian in our party, and we have 3 people because that's 3. And
3 in.
I started actually crying laughing because I was just fucking around with objects and like stacked a bunch of, you can just move stuff around in that game, and like I kept getting like stray cats with fucking barrels and stuff. And it's like one of the things I was moving around was like the stools that characters will sit on. And I moved a bunch of stools on top of a fire pit that was just floating above all these fucking twigs. And the character who's normally sits in the stool doesn't give a shit that you moved the stool into a spot that shouldn't be reachable. So she just fucking waddled over there and then teleported on top of the stool. And it's just staring at me. And I was like, what? And I just couldn't handle that. So that really...
I think we did that too in our run. There was stacks of stools and people sitting on them in past, like, it was inside of a building, I believe, and it was well past where the roof would have been. So you're just like sitting up on this stack of stools in the abyss. That game was so fucked.
Yeah.
Everything from the barrel to the cats. I to this day I still think that's one of like the most outright demented runs I've ever had. I still get comments about it every now and then. Just
it's a good one.
Though from start to finish, it's just completely stupid as fuck.
Is that actually up on the website? I don't even know.
Yes.
I should go re-download that one, I think. But yeah, I just can't
autistic.
believe that they made a game where you throw barrels at people that would kill them. What the fuck is wrong with these people?
Because the game was so fucking hyper lethal.
Yeah.
The game went from us being just getting destroyed by everything to just whacking them with a barrel and then eventually having 2 nigh unkillable cats.
Yeah.
You just teleported across the map and buffed. Just because I talked to the fucking NPC and broke a script.
Yeah.
It was just ridiculous.
The gamification of like, oh, let me just quickly talk to this guy so that everybody can buff people, because whoever's in dialogue doesn't have their debuffs turned off or whatever, like they don't expire.
Well, I think it was because combat didn't initiate.
Yeah.
so that nothing was happening, and then it just snapped everything in half.
It's so stupid. It's a very dumb game. I was actually because I was thinking about that you recorded that Unreal presentation for me a while, maybe a couple weeks ago now, and I've been tinkering every now and then with that when I'm not busy with the demo and with CMBW. But I'm obviously trying to build a game that's supposed to be you describe your Apex X as Dark Souls but difficult, which I think is perfect because it pisses so many people off, I'm sure. But I would describe mine as Divinity but good, right, or whatever. It's like we don't have this RNG bullshit. Like I found out apparently every character has a 5% chance to miss or whatever. It's like, what the fuck? Like what?
It felt like a lot more than that.
Yeah, it might be more than that, but that's what I was told. And then I don't know, man. It's just so dumb. And the whole critical system and stuff is because it's turn-based, you don't really have the same mechanical skill involved. So I understand that they would need some replacement for that somehow, but I don't know. I feel like that's really dumb, and it should definitely be better somehow. But what can you do, man? So we'll see. We'll see where that experiment goes. But yeah, all in all, I think we've got some exciting shit in CMBW. We definitely made some interesting progress. I'm getting more maps made as well, obviously, with my fucking April challenge I've given myself. And I think it's pretty exciting to have access to more stuff. Shambler is actually starting a campaign, which is going to be amusing, I'm sure. And the also that Stratus Tygo is apparently he's going to do. This came to my head when we were talking about taking somebody else's idea but doing better on the execution, and how that's not really super compelling to us, but we can at least see the value in that. And apparently Stratus Tygo is going to port the StarCraft 1 campaigns to CMBW, which is well, I'm sure it'll be.
I look forward to him dealing with the installation maps.
Yeah, of course. Well, hey, I think we did modify installation to be buildable. I just never bothered adding creep to it. I don't think so.
What he needs to do is he needs to make them build and destroy.
Yeah.
But every single ramp is one of those tiny little narrow ramps, and he just has a giant maze of them.
Yeah.
And the map can be about Tacitor losing his mind trying to navigate these fucking ramps.
Yeah. Who would build a
And that's how he becomes an insane prophet, ancient alien.
Yeah.
Is by navigating all the ramps and having an acid trip.
Obviously,
Speaking of acid trips,
okay,
today is a very special day.
Oh, that's true.
It is Hitler's birthday. and it's also 420.
Yes.
Smoke weed.
Dude, that's true. That's our sign off, I think. Smoke
That
weed.
is.
Every day, especially today.
Every day.